My name is Nora Ashford. I am 40 years old. 4 months ago, my own family turned my birthday dinner into a courtroom, and I was the only person in the room who didn't know the verdict yet. 60 relatives filled that private room at the Cedar House restaurant, and not one of them was smiling when I walked in. My father, Walter, stood at the head of the table holding a folder. Inside it was a paternity test. Fake, though I didn't say that part out loud yet. "You're not a real heir," he told me in front of everyone. "Sign your share away." My mother, Diane, reached across the table and pulled the deed to our family's properties straight out of my hands before I'd even opened the folder myself. My brother, Preston, stood off to the side with his phone raised, filming what he still believed, right up until the last second, was going to be a heartwarming family moment worth posting online. I sat very still. I have spent my whole career reading documents for a living, catching the small mistakes other people miss. And some part of me was already cataloging every detail in that room the way I would at my desk on any ordinary Tuesday. It kept me from shaking. Twice before, this family had tried to erase me. Once with whispers at a funeral, once with a forged signature I found on my own, buried in a document that was supposed to protect me instead of erasing me. Both times, I let it go because I didn't have enough yet to make it stick. This time, I did, because that's the moment the doors at the back of the room opened, and 2 police officers walked in behind a woman I had been told my entire life had died before I was even old enough to remember her face. She was holding a birth certificate. My birth certificate. The real one. Before I take you back to where this actually started, I want to ask you something. If you've ever had people who were supposed to protect you use your own name against you instead, stay with me to the end and tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight and what time it is where you are. Now let me take you back 4 months to the week my grandmother died, and a dinner where a woman I had trusted my whole life said one name out loud that she should have buried 20 years earlier, 4 months ago, before any of this had a name. I was just a woman at her desk on a Tuesday morning, doing the only kind of work I have ever been good at. I examine documents for a living, titles, deeds, closing paperwork, the kind of records most people sign without reading past the highlighted line. At Meridian Title and Escrow, my job is to notice the thing that doesn't sit right. A signature that leans a little too consistently the same way across 3 different years. A notary stamp that's a shade too crisp for a document that's supposed to be a decade old. That morning, I had a file open on a strip mall sale gone wrong. A seller who'd forged his own brother's signature to close a deal faster than probate allowed. It wasn't dramatic work. It was quiet, patient, the kind of thing that rewards you for paying attention when everyone else has stopped looking. I had been at Meridian for 12 years by then. Long enough that the partners let me train the newer examiners. Long enough that I had stopped needing to prove myself there the way I still, somehow, needed to prove myself everywhere else. It was strange, the way competence could feel so solid in one room and so invisible in another. At work, when I found something wrong, people listened. At home, I had spent most of my life learning to say things twice, sometimes 3 times, before anyone treated them as fact instead of opinion. My phone buzzed against the desk. Preston. My brother almost never called before noon. Preston ran operations at Ashford Properties, our father's company, and by 9 in the morning he was usually 3 meetings deep into a day that left no room for anything that wasn't already on his calendar. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice low, the way I always did at my desk. "Everything okay. It's Grandma June," he said. "She passed early this morning, in her sleep. Mom's already over there." I sat back in my chair, I'd seen June 2 weeks earlier, at a Sunday dinner where she'd fallen asleep in her armchair before dessert, the way she always did, and I remembered thinking, the way you think things you don't say out loud, that she looked smaller than she used to. "I'm so sorry. Preston..." Yeah, a pause, the kind he never used to leave. "Look, the funeral's Thursday, and Mom wants to do the thing with her stuff this weekend. All the keepsakes and whatever. She wants everyone there." June had never been wealthy in any way that mattered to a bank. A modest house, some furniture older than either of us, a few pieces of jewelry, and one small trust that mostly covered her own care in the last years. Nothing worth fighting over, by any reasonable measure. But June had also been the one person in that family who had never once made me feel like an asterisk attached to somebody else's name. And some part of me wanted to be there for that alone. "Of course I'll be there," I said. Saturday, at the house." Another pause. Aunt Paulette's already asking questions about who gets what. I didn't answer that right away. Paulette had opinions about most things, and family belongings had always been one of her favorite subjects, usually delivered in a tone that suggested she'd already decided the outcome before anyone else got a vote. Years earlier at a cousin's wedding, I had watched her spend 20 minutes explaining to a table of strangers exactly which side of the family a particular set of silverware was supposed to belong to, as though bloodlines were something you could trace through cutlery. I had laughed about it in the car with a friend afterward. It hadn't occurred to me yet that Paulette's need to sort people into categories of who truly belonged and who didn't would ever be pointed directly at me. "I'm sure it'll be fine," I said, mostly because it was easier to say than to explain the small, familiar knot that had already started forming in my stomach. "Yeah," Preston said again, and I could hear him already half out the door, moving on to the next thing on his list. "See you Saturday." "Nora?" I set the phone down and looked at the folder still open in front of me, the forged signature glowing faintly under my desk lamp where I'd circled it in red. I thought about June's small, steady kindness, the way she used to slip me an extra plate of food to take home during the years money was tight, never making a production out of it, never mentioning it again afterward. She had been fair to me in a house where fairness wasn't always the default setting. I didn't know yet that fairness was about to become the entire subject of the weekend. I finished the file, sent my findings up to the underwriting team, and drove home that evening thinking mostly about June, about the particular quiet that settles over a family in the days right after a loss, when everyone is still deciding how to feel before they decide how to act. I had no reason yet to think Saturday would be anything other than sad. I had spent 40 years learning exactly how my family behaved in ordinary moments. I had far less practice with how they behaved when there was something on the table worth dividing. That gap in my experience was about to close, faster than I expected. I want to be fair here, because fairness is the entire point of what happened later. So I should practice it now. Walter and Diane Ashford adopted me when I was a few months old. I never knew any other parents. And for most of my childhood, I didn't think to look for a story underneath the one I'd been given. They fed me, clothed me, sent me to decent schools, showed up to the school plays where I stood in the back row. On paper, and for a long time in my own memory, it looked like an ordinary childhood. It was Preston's childhood that made the shape of mine easier to see, in hindsight, than it had been to feel at the time. Preston is 2 years younger than I am, Walter and Diane's biological son, born 3 years after they brought me home. Nobody ever said out loud that he mattered more. Nobody had to. It showed up in smaller ways, spread out over enough years that no single instance felt worth mentioning on its own. When Preston wanted to play travel hockey, Walter cleared his weekends for it without being asked twice. When I wanted to take an extra art class in high school, Diane asked if it wouldn't be better to focus on something practical instead. College was the clearest version of it. Preston's tuition, room, and board at a private university were paid in full. No loans, no long conversations about return on investment. I got into a good state school on my own merit, and when I asked about help with the cost, Walter told me, not unkindly, that he thought it would be good for my character to carry some of it myself. I believed him for a while. I worked 2 jobs through most of college, and came out the other side with a manageable amount of debt and a stubborn kind of pride about having done it without help. It took me years to notice that pride and resentment can live in the exact same sentence. I remember one afternoon in particular, not because it was dramatic, but because it was so small it barely registered at the time. I was 11, and I had won a regional essay contest, the kind of thing that comes with a certificate and a 5-minute mention at a school assembly. I brought the certificate home, proud of it in the uncomplicated way children are proud of things. Diane glanced at it, said that was nice, and then spent the next 20 minutes on the phone with a friend, describing in detail how well Preston had done in his Pee-wee hockey game that same afternoon. The certificate ended up in a drawer in the hallway desk. I found it there, still creased from being folded to fit, when I helped clean that same desk out years later. Nobody had thrown it away. Nobody had framed it either. Grandma June was different. She was Walter's mother, sharp and plain-spoken, well into her 80s, the kind of woman who noticed things other people worked hard to keep hidden. She used to tell me, more than once, that I had her late husband's patience, the way I could sit with a problem instead of flinching away from it. It was a small thing to say to a kid. I held on to it for 30 years anyway, because it was one of the few times someone in that family had looked at me and seen something specific, instead of comparing me to somebody else in the room. That was the woman we had lost. I drove to her house that Saturday afternoon with a box of tissues on the passenger seat that I never ended up needing, because by the time I arrived, the grief in the house had already curdled into something else. Paulette's sedan was parked crooked across 2 spots in the driveway, the way she always parked when she believed she'd arrived first and intended to stay that way. Diane's car was there too, and Walter's, and a scatter of others belonging to cousins and second cousins I mostly recognized from holiday dinners and the occasional funeral. Preston's truck sat at the curb, backed in at an angle that suggested he'd left himself room to leave early if he needed to. I stayed behind the wheel for a minute before going in, the way I sometimes did before a difficult closing at work, running through what I actually wanted from the day. I wanted to say goodbye to June properly, away from the noise of the funeral itself. I wanted, if I was honest, one small object that had been hers. Something to keep on a shelf where I could see it. Nothing more complicated than that. I had no idea, walking up that driveway, that wanting something small and reasonable would somehow be treated, before the afternoon was over, as an accusation. Inside, the house smelled like it always had, like cedar and old paper and the particular brand of lavender hand cream June kept by every sink. Voices drifted from the living room, low and careful in the specific way people talk in a house that still belongs to someone who just died. I heard Paulette's voice rise slightly above the others, already mid-sentence about something, and felt that same old knot tighten in my stomach before I'd even crossed the threshold. I told myself it was nothing. I had told myself that before, plenty of times, over plenty of years, and I had eventually, been proven wrong. Inside, the living room had been rearranged the way rooms get rearranged after a death. Furniture pushed back to make space for boxes that shouldn't have needed to exist so soon. June's things were spread across the coffee table and the dining table beyond it jewelry boxes, a stack of photo albums with cracked spines, a set of china nobody had used since before I was born, a shoebox of loose photographs nobody had gotten around to sorting. Diane was directing traffic in the quiet, efficient way she directed everything, telling people where to set things down, which pile was which. Walter stood near the window with his hands in his pockets, present, but somehow apart from it, the way he tended to be at anything that wasn't strictly business. Preston was crouched by the china cabinet, already filming a slow pan across the room on his phone, narrating softly for whatever audience he imagined watching later. Cousins I saw twice a year drifted between rooms in 2s and 3s, speaking in the hushed, careful tones people use in a house that still smells like someone who is gone. Paulette found me before I'd even set down my coat. "There you are," she said, in the particular tone she used when she'd already decided something and wanted an audience for the announcement. "We were just talking about how to divide things up fairly. Blood relatives first, obviously. And then whatever's left can go around." I felt the sentence land somewhere behind my ribs before I fully understood why. Blood relatives was not a phrase June had ever used about her own family. It was Paulette's phrase, applied to a room June had spent 40 years trying to make feel like one thing instead of two. "I'm not here to fight over anything," I said, keeping my voice even. "I just wanted to see if there was one small thing of hers I could keep. That's all." Of course," Paulette said, already turning away toward the dining table, where a hand-painted trinket dish sat beside a stack of embroidered handkerchiefs. It was the dish I'd been thinking about the whole drive over, a small ceramic piece June had kept on her nightstand for as long as I could remember, chipped along one edge in a way that only made it feel more like hers. I watched Paulette pick it up, turn it over once in her hands, and set it carefully into a box already marked, in her own handwriting, with Preston's name. "Preston's starting his own place soon," she said, not quite looking at me. "He'll want nice things for it." Preston, from across the room, lowered his phone just long enough to look faintly embarrassed. "Aunt Paulette, I don't need nonsense," Paulette said. "It should stay in the family." There it was again, that phrase, dropped so casually it barely registered as a blow to anyone but me. Diane, a few feet away, kept sorting silverware into felt-lined trays without looking up. Walter said nothing at all, which by then I understood to be its own kind of answer. I could have pushed the point. I had every reasonable claim to a single chipped dish worth perhaps $11 at an estate sale, and I knew it. But some old, well-worn instinct in me, the one that had spent 40 years choosing the smallest possible fight in any room full of Ashfords, told me to let it go, to save my energy for something that mattered more. I did not yet know how wrong I was about what would end up mattering. "It's fine," I said, and I meant it. Mostly. Standing there. "There's plenty else here." I moved toward the photo albums instead, telling myself the dish had never really been the point, that I'd come for June, not for an object. I spent the next half hour turning pages with a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years, pointing out faces neither of us could fully place anymore, letting the ordinary rhythm of the afternoon carry me somewhere calmer. One photograph stopped me. June, at maybe 40, standing in front of this same house with a much younger Walter and a toddler on her hip, who had to be Paulette's daughter. Everyone squinting into a sun that had set decades ago. My cousin leaned over my shoulder and said something about how young June looked, how strange it was to see her without gray hair, and for a few minutes the two of us simply sat with it, the ordinary ache of missing someone, uncomplicated by anything else. It was the kind of quiet I had come to the house hoping for. I let myself have it, fully, for as long as it lasted. Across the room, I could hear Diane's voice picking up pace, directing two of the cousins toward a box of table linens. Her tone brisk in the way it got when she wanted an afternoon to move faster than the people in it were moving. Walter had drifted out to the back porch at some point, a habit of his at family gatherings. Present enough to be counted, absent enough to avoid most conversations. Preston had put his phone down long enough to help carry boxes to the cars, which I noted almost fondly, as evidence that he wasn't entirely oblivious, just comfortable in a way I had never quite gotten to be in that house. It didn't stay calm for long. Paulette had only been circling, the way she always did before the thing she actually wanted to say, and by the time she crossed the living room again, I could tell from the set of her shoulders that circling time was over. Paulette crossed the living room with a stack of embroidered handkerchiefs in her hands, the kind of prop that made whatever she was about to say look incidental, like she'd only stopped to mention it in passing. "I was just telling everyone," she said, loud enough that the room's low murmur thinned out around her, "that it makes sense for family things to stay with family. Real family." She set the handkerchiefs down with a small, deliberate click of her rings against the table. No offense to anyone, of course. It's just practical. I felt every head in the room turn, not toward Paulette, but toward me, the way people look at the person a comment is aimed at even when the comment itself never quite says a name. "Paulette," I said, keeping my voice level. "I think everyone here loved June. That's not really in question." "Of course it isn't." She smiled, the kind of smile that never reaches past the mouth. "I just mean, blood is blood. You can love someone your whole life and still not technically be, well, you know." "Say it," I said. I hadn't planned to say those two words. They came out anyway, quiet and flat, and the room went very still around them. Paulette's chin lifted a fraction. "I only mean that you were never really a Ashford sweetheart. Not by birth. Some people just don't like admitting that out loud, but everyone's always known it. You were brought in, that's all I'm saying." There it was. Finally. Said plainly instead of hinted at. The same accusation I had absorbed in smaller doses my entire life, now delivered whole in a room full of people who had known me since I was a baby. I looked at Walter first, out of some old reflex, waiting for the correction that should have come automatically, the way it would have come automatically for Preston. Walter shifted his weight, glanced toward the window, and said only, "Paulette, that's enough. Let's not do this today," in a tone so mild it barely qualified as a defense at all. I looked at Diane next. Diane was very carefully folding a linen napkin, her eyes fixed on the fabric in her hands, and she said nothing whatsoever. Nobody corrected the word Paulette hadn't quite used but had clearly meant. Nobody said, "She is family, full stop," the way I had heard people say it about Preston 1,000 times without anyone needing to ask. The silence in that room lasted maybe 4 seconds. It felt considerably longer. "I raised you the same as I raised Preston," Diane finally said, still not looking up from the napkin, which was not the same as saying Paulette was wrong. A cousin near the china cabinet cleared her throat and mumbled something about checking on the coffee. Another one suddenly found the photo albums extremely interesting. Preston, to his credit, at least lowered his phone all the way this time, though he didn't say anything either. I have stood in rooms far more hostile than that living room, in a professional sense, I have sat across from clients who screamed at me over a delayed closing, who accused me of costing them money out of spite, when the truth was simply that their own paperwork hadn't held up. I have learned, over 12 years, how to keep my voice level and my face unreadable when someone is furious with me for reasons that have nothing to do with anything I actually did. I found, standing in that living room, that none of that training was any use to me at all. Professional composure is built for strangers. It has almost no defense against people who have known you since before you could speak, aiming, with apparent ease, for the exact place where the armor doesn't reach. My face went hot. My hands, at my sides, curled into loose fists I didn't remember making. Somewhere behind me, I heard Diane say something else to smooth the moment over, her voice pitched for the room rather than for me. And I understood with a kind of tired clarity that the smoothing was for everyone else's comfort, not mine. "I'm going to step outside for a minute," I said, to no one in particular. And I meant it as calmly as it came out, though my pulse was doing something considerably less calm underneath. I walked through the kitchen and out the back door onto June's small patio, where a wind chime she'd hung there decades ago was moving faintly in the afternoon air, the same 4 notes it had always made, indifferent to everything happening on the other side of the glass. I stood there for a while, breathing, watching that chime turn slowly on its string, and told myself, the way I had told myself so many times before, that it didn't matter, that Paulette's opinion carried no real weight, that I knew who I was regardless of what any of them decided to call me. I thought about June, about the specific, uncomplicated way she used to say my name, no qualifier attached to it, no quiet asterisk. I thought about how strange it was that the one person in that house who had never once made me feel like a guest in my own family was the one person no longer there to say so out loud. Through the kitchen window behind me, I could hear the room slowly returning to its ordinary business. Drawers opening, paper rustling, someone laughing quietly at something unrelated. Grief and cruelty. I was learning, could apparently share the same afternoon without either one canceling the other out. It was, I would learn a few weeks later, one of the few times in my life I had been almost completely right and almost completely wrong in the very same breath. I don't know how long I stood on that patio before Diane came looking for me, long enough that the light had shifted, gone a little more gold across the yard, the specific slant of a late afternoon that always made me think, for no reason I could name, of childhood evenings waiting to be called in for dinner. She stepped out through the sliding door with a small wooden box in her hands, the kind with a hinged lid and a faded floral pattern painted along the edge, the sort of box that had clearly held someone's private things for a very long time. "June wanted you to have this," Diane said. She didn't apologize for what had happened inside. She never did, in my experience, not directly. But she held the box out toward me with both hands, which was, for Diane, its own kind of gesture. "She told me a few months ago, said to make sure you got it, no matter what." I took the box carefully, the wood smooth and worn under my fingers, and opened the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, was a small brooch, tarnished silver shaped like a sprig of lily of the valley. The kind of old-fashioned piece that had probably been fashionable sometime in the 1950s. It wasn't worth anything to speak of. It was worth, to me, considerably more than the china cabinet and everything inside it combined. "She used to wear this to church," I said, mostly to myself, remembering it pinned to the collar of June's good coat on Easter mornings, one of those small visual details that lodges itself somewhere and never quite leaves. She said you always asked about it when you were little, Diane said. Said you used to touch it during the sermon, when you thought no one was looking. I hadn't remembered that detail until she said it. And then, all at once, I did. The exact texture of the metal under a 6-year-old's fingers. The quiet of being allowed to sit close to someone who never once made you feel like you were in the way. Thank you, I said. And I meant it. Even with the sting of the living room still sitting somewhere under my ribs. I thought about June in that pew, upright and unhurried in a way that used to embarrass me a little as a child. The way she'd let the rest of the family file out first while she stayed behind to fold the bulletin into careful quarters and tuck it into her purse, as if the service deserved to be kept rather than discarded. She never rushed through anything that mattered to her. I understood, holding that brooch, that she must have counted me among the things that mattered, even if she rarely said so in so many words. She simply showed it, the same way she'd shown it with the extra plate of food, the same way she was showing it now. From somewhere she could no longer reach me except through a box, and a memory Diane had been asked to carry on her behalf. There was a version of that afternoon where Diane could have said more, where she could have turned Paulette's comment back on her, right there in the living room, in front of everyone, the way I would have done for Preston without a second thought. She hadn't. I understood, even then, that I was going to have to decide how much weight to put on that absence, and that the honest answer was more than I wanted to admit out loud. Diane nodded, glanced back toward the house, and then, unusually for her, didn't immediately turn to go back inside. She stood there a moment longer, arms crossed loosely against the evening chill starting to come in. Paulette shouldn't have said that, she said finally, not quite meeting my eyes. In there, it wasn't the time, not, she was wrong. Not, you are my daughter and no one gets to say otherwise. Just a comment about timing, delivered to the middle distance rather than to me directly. I noticed the difference. I filed it away the way I filed away small discrepancies in documents at work, without deciding yet what, if anything, it meant. It's fine, I said again. The same 2 words I'd used with Paulette an hour earlier, worn smooth from overuse. I drove home with the little wooden box on the passenger seat where the box of tissues had been that morning, and somewhere on the highway, with the brooch catching the last of the daylight through the window, the tightness in my chest finally started to loosen. June had thought of me, specifically, deliberately, in the last months of her life. She had made sure something small and true would find its way to me regardless of what anyone else in that house decided I deserved. I called a friend from the car, hands-free, the way I usually did on the drive home from anything difficult. Mostly just to hear another voice that wasn't running the day's events back and forth through some private courtroom of its own. I didn't tell her everything. Not that night. I told her June had left me something, and that the day had been hard in the ordinary way. Funerals and family gatherings are hard, and left the rest of it folded up small, the way I tended to do with things I hadn't finished deciding how to feel about. At home, I set the little wooden box on my dresser, the brooch pinned upright against the velvet the way June used to wear it, and stood looking at it for longer than the moment probably warranted. Whatever Paulette believed about where I came from, whatever silence Walter and Diane had offered instead of an answer, June had left no ambiguity behind it all. She had simply, quietly, made sure I knew. It was, for that evening at least, enough. I had no way of knowing yet how much I would come to lean on that certainty in the weeks ahead, or how badly I would need at least one undisputed fact about who had genuinely been on my side. 3 days later, On a Tuesday evening while I was still unpacking a work bag I hadn't fully put away since the weekend. My phone rang with a number I didn't immediately recognize. Nora, it's Evelyn. Evelyn Reyes. I was June's neighbor for... Oh, must be 30 years now. A pause. Warm and a little uncertain. The kind of pause people use when they aren't sure they're calling for a good reason. I was at the house Saturday. I don't know if you noticed me. I mostly stayed out of the way. I remembered her, vaguely. A quiet woman near the kitchen doorway who had spent most of the afternoon helping wrap dishes in newspaper rather than staking claims on any of them. I remember, I said. Thank you for being there. June thought a lot of you. The feeling was mutual. Evelyn's voice caught slightly, and she took a moment before continuing. That's actually part of why I'm calling. I heard what Paulette said to you about not really being family. My stomach tightened, an old, familiar reflex. It's fine, I started to say. The phrase worn so smooth by then it came out almost automatically. It's not fine, Evelyn said, gently but without hesitation. And I don't think you should have to keep telling yourself it is. I've known this family a long time. Nora, longer than Paulette probably remembers I have. And I want you to know that what she said in there, that ugly little insinuation, it isn't new. She's been saying some version of it since you were small. Since before you were old enough to understand it was aimed at you at all. What do you mean, since I was small? I mean, Paulette has always had a chip on her shoulder about you. Specifically, not the rest of the family, just you. And it never made any sense to me. She used to say things at church functions, decades ago now. Little comments to the other women about how convenient it was that Diane and Walter got a baby exactly when they wanted one. No waiting list. No fuss. I always thought it was jealousy talking. Paulette had trouble having children of her own for years before her daughter came along. I think watching Diane get a daughter so easily, so quickly, ate at her more than she ever admitted. I sat down slowly on the edge of my bed, the wooden box with June's brooch still sitting on the dresser across the room, catching the last of the street light through the blinds. So she made it up, the whole not really family thing. I don't know exactly what she believes and what she's just repeating to feel important, Evelyn said. But I do know she's never once had proof of anything, not that I ever heard in all these years of hinting at it. It's always been vague. Insinuation, not information. That's what struck me as strange, actually, listening to her Saturday. Usually when Paulette gossips, she loves details. This time she just said the same tired line she's always said, and then went quiet the second you pushed back. That's not like her. I turned that observation over slowly, the way I'd turn over an inconsistency in a set of closing documents, the kind of small mismatch that usually meant something, even before I knew what. That's not like her how Paulette loves an audience and she loves specifics. If she actually had something concrete, some story, some fact, she'd have used it, believe me, she'd have used it years ago, the first time anyone challenged her on it. Instead, she spent 30 years circling the same vague insult and never landing anywhere near an actual reason for it. Evelyn's voice softened. I just didn't want you going home this week, thinking there was some secret everyone else already knew. I don't believe there is one. I think it's an old, ugly habit of hers. Nothing more. But I also thought you deserved to hear that from someone who's watched this family a long time, instead of sitting with it alone. Thank you, I said, and meant it more than I had any of the times I'd said it that week already. That actually means a lot. We talked a few more minutes, about June mostly, about a garden club the two of them had belonged to together for nearly 2 decades, About the ridiculous, oversized Dahlia's June used to enter into the county fair every summer. Half proud and half embarrassed by how much she cared about winning, it was good to hear those stories. It reminded me that June had existed as a whole person outside of her role in my family, with her own friendships and small competitive streaks and private jokes that had nothing to do with any of us. By the time we hung up, some of the tightness in my chest had eased, replaced by something else entirely. Not relief, exactly, curiosity, sharpened into something closer to suspicion. If Paulette had nothing concrete, why circle the subject at all, for 30 years, without ever once producing a fact to back it up? People usually didn't work that hard to defend an insult they'd invented purely for spite. I was starting to think, a difference between a lie built from nothing and a lie built to protect something specific. I didn't know yet which one I was dealing with. I only knew, standing in my bedroom with June's brooch catching the streetlight, that I intended to find out. I waited until the following weekend to drive out to Paulette's place, a tidy brick house on a street with too many identical mailboxes, the kind of neighborhood that had looked exactly the same for as long as I could remember visiting it. I hadn't called ahead. Some instinct told me that if I gave Paulette advance notice, she would have time to compose a version of the conversation that suited her better than the truth would. She answered the door in gardening gloves, a trowel still in one hand, and her expression shifted through several stages in the space of about 2 seconds: surprise, wariness, and then a kind of brittle politeness she pulled over the first two like a sheet over furniture. "Nora, this is unexpected." "I won't stay long," I said. "I just have a question, and I'd rather ask it in person." She hesitated, then stepped back to let me into the front hall, though she didn't invite me any further than that, and didn't take off the gloves either, as if she wanted the option of returning to her garden the moment this conversation ended. "I want to know why you keep saying, 'I'm not really family,'" I said, deciding there was no version of easing into it that would make the question land any softer. "Not the vague version, the actual reason. You've been saying it since I was a child, apparently, long before Saturday." Something flickered across her face, quick and involuntary, gone before she could fully suppress it. "I don't know what you mean by that." "Evelyn Reyes says otherwise." Paulette's mouth tightened at the name, a small, sharp motion, there and gone. "Evelyn talks too much. She always has." Maybe. But she also said something that stuck with me. She said you've never once had an actual reason. Just the same insinuation, over and over, for 30 years, with nothing behind it. I kept my voice level, the way I'd keep it across a table from an angry client, though my pulse was doing something considerably less professional underneath my ribs. "So, which is it? Paulette, is there nothing behind it? Or is there something you've just never said out loud for a long moment?" She didn't answer. She looked past me, toward the door, toward the garden beyond it, anywhere that wasn't my face. And I watched her jaw work like she was chewing on several different sentences and discarding each one before it reached her mouth. "Some things," she said, finally, very quietly, "are better left where they are." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one you're getting." Her voice had gone thin, almost fragile, nothing like the sharp, performative tone she had used in June's living room. "Your parents made their choices a long time ago. It isn't my place to undo them." "My parents," I repeated. "Walter and Diane." "Yes." "Then whose choices are we actually talking about? If not theirs, I don't think I expected an answer." I think, if I'm honest, I asked mostly to watch her reaction. The way I'd sometimes ask a client a question during a closing, not because I needed the answer, but because I needed to see whether they'd flinch. Paulette flinched. Her gloved hand tightened around the trowel until her knuckles went pale under the fabric. Vivian shouldn't have... She started, and then stopped herself so abruptly it was almost physical, like she'd bitten down on the rest of the sentence before it could escape. The name sat there in the hallway between us, small and strange and entirely unfamiliar. I had never heard it before in my life. Not once. Not in 30 years of Ashford dinners and holidays and family stories told and retold until they'd worn smooth. Who's Vivian, I asked. Paulette's face had gone the color of old paper. Nobody. Forget I said anything. I need to get back to the garden. She was already moving toward the door, physically steering me back toward it with the particular urgency of someone trying to end a conversation before it could go anywhere further. Paulette. I mean it, Nora. Forget it. It was a slip of the tongue, that's all. She had the door open now, holding it, her whole body angled toward getting me through it and closing it behind me. You should go. I went. There didn't seem to be any version of staying that would get more out of her, not that afternoon, not with her hands shaking faintly around the handle of that trowel and her eyes refusing to meet mine. I sat in my car outside her house for a long time afterward, the single word turning over and over in my mind. Vivian. Not a name that belonged to anyone I knew, not a cousin, not a family friend, not anyone who had ever come up at a single holiday dinner in 40 years. But it was a name Paulette knew well enough to almost let slip before catching herself. And a name that had visibly frightened her the instant it left her mouth. Whatever she had almost said next, whatever Vivian shouldn't have done, it clearly mattered more than a chipped ceramic dish or an old grudge about who got invited to which wedding. I didn't have anywhere to take that name yet. No last name, no context, nothing to search for that wouldn't return 1,000 irrelevant strangers. I wrote it down anyway, on the back of a receipt from my glove box, the way I'd note down any small anomaly I intended to come back to later, once I had more to go on. I had no idea, sitting there in that quiet cul-de-sac, just how much more there would eventually be. I spent that Sunday evening at my kitchen table with my laptop open, doing the kind of search I would have advised a client against doing on their own, precisely because I knew how little it would give me. Vivian, alone, was almost useless. It's a common enough name that a plain search returned actresses, athletes, a handful of small businesses, none of it connected to anything Ashford. I tried adding Paulette's last name, then Diane's maiden name, which I had to stop and actually think to recall. Since nobody in that family talked about Diane's side with any regularity, nothing lined up. I tried the county's public records index, the same kind of search I ran at work several times a week without a second thought, looking for a Vivian connected to any Ashford property, any Ashford transaction, any filing at all from the years I would have been an infant. It came back clean, too clean. Honestly, for a search that broad, public records rarely stay that empty unless someone has genuinely never crossed paths with the county, or unless the records themselves have been managed carefully enough to keep them that way. I sat back from the screen at some point, aware that I'd been staring at it long enough that my eyes had started to ache, and made myself say out loud, to the empty kitchen, exactly what I was doing. I was trying to build a case out of one word a frightened, elderly woman had almost said and then desperately tried to take back. That was all I had. No last name, no date, no reason to think Vivian was even a person still living, or a person at all, rather than the name of a pet, a boat, a business partner from decades ago that had nothing to do with me whatsoever. I tried one more angle before I let the evening go. I texted Preston, casually, the way you'd ask about anything unimportant. Random question. Have you ever heard the name Vivian mentioned around the family? Some old friend of Grandma June's? Maybe his reply came back 20 minutes later, short and unbothered. Doesn't ring a bell. Why? No reason. I typed back. Thought I heard it at the funeral and couldn't place it. He didn't ask anything further, which told me less than I wanted it to. Preston had never been a particularly curious person about the family's history, not in the way I sometimes was, and his lack of reaction could just as easily have meant there was nothing to react to, as it could have meant he genuinely knew nothing at all. I turned the exchange over anyway, the way I turned over most things that felt slightly off, and set it aside with everything else I didn't yet have enough to make sense of. It would have been reasonable at that point to let it go. I want to be honest about how close I came to doing exactly that. I am not naturally the kind of person who chases down every loose thread just because it exists. Most of my life in that family had been built around choosing which threads were worth pulling and which ones I let lie, because pulling too many, too visibly, had a way of getting me labeled difficult, dramatic, ungrateful, whichever word happened to be in fashion that particular year. But there was something about the specific way Paulette's face had changed, the color draining out of it in real time, that I couldn't quite talk myself out of. People don't react like that to nothing. In my line of work, that kind of reaction, the sudden pallor, the scramble to walk something back, the too quick insistence that it didn't matter, was usually the surest sign that it mattered enormously. I closed the laptop a little after 11, no closer to an answer than I'd been at the start of the evening, and told myself, the way I'd tell a client whose paperwork had hit a dead end through no fault of their own, that some trails simply required more than one evening and a search engine. Sometimes you needed a different kind of record entirely, one that wasn't indexed anywhere public, one that only surfaced when something forced it to. At work the next morning, I caught myself pulling up the county's archive of old notarized filings twice, out of habit more than any real hope of finding something new, before making myself stop. I had a strip mall fraud case still sitting open on my desk, an actual paying job that deserved my attention. And I told myself firmly that Vivian, whoever she was, could wait for evenings and weekends. The way most personal mysteries had to wait around the edges of an ordinary working life. It was a reasonable plan. It even held for a few days. What I hadn't accounted for was how much harder it is to set something down once you've started noticing the shape of its absence everywhere. I caught myself, more than once that week, staring a half-second too long at old documents in unrelated files, half expecting, absurdly, to see that name surface somewhere it had no business being. I didn't know yet what that something would turn out to be. I only knew, lying awake later than I should have, that I intended to keep the name written on that receipt somewhere I wouldn't lose it, tucked now into the drawer of my nightstand, folded small, waiting. Some questions. I was starting to understand, don't announce when they're finally about to be answered. They simply sit quietly in a drawer until the rest of your life catches up to them. By the following Friday, I needed a night that had nothing to do with any of it. Camille Boyd had been my closest friend since our second year at Meridian, back when we were both still junior examiners sharing a cramped office and complaining about the same difficult manager. She'd since moved up to a different department, but we still met most Fridays, usually at the same tiny Italian place 2 blocks from the office. A spot with checkered tablecloths and a waiter who'd stopped bothering to hand us menus years ago because we always ordered the same thing. "You've had that look all week," Camille said, twirling pasta onto her fork without much enthusiasm for actually eating it yet. "The one where you're doing that thing you do, cataloging something. I don't have a look." "You absolutely have a look." She pointed her fork at me. "It's the same face you make right before you tell underwriting. There's a problem with a file everyone else already signed off on." I laughed. Actually laughed, for what felt like the first time in a week and a half. "Fine. There might be a small mystery, family stuff. It's probably nothing." "Is it Paulette again? How did you know it was Paulette?" "Because it's always either Paulette or your parents forgetting your birthday exists, and you already told me your birthday's not for a few months." Camille softened, setting her fork down. "What happened?" I gave her the short version. The trinket dish, the comment in the living room, the name Paulette had almost let slip and then panicked over. Camille listened the way she always did, without interrupting, without rushing to fix it, which was, I'd come to understand over the years, its own kind of gift. "For what it's worth," she said when I finished, "I've known you 9 years, and I have never once needed a DNA test or a family tree to know exactly who you are. You're the person who caught that title fraud on the Baker Street property when 3 other examiners signed off on it. You're the person who drove 2 hours in an ice storm because I locked myself out and had nowhere to go. You're the person who remembers everyone's coffee order without being asked twice. Paulette doesn't get a vote on any of that, and frankly, neither does anyone else in that family who spent 40 years treating your presence like something they were doing you a favor by tolerating." I hadn't expected the last part to land quite as hard as it did. Camille rarely let herself be that blunt about my family, usually out of some careful instinct not to push me somewhere I wasn't ready to go. And hearing it stated so plainly, over pasta, in a restaurant we'd been coming to for years, made something in my chest loosen that I hadn't fully realized was still clenched. "I know," I said, and mostly meant it. "It's just strange. Being 40 and realizing there's a whole room of your own history you've never been allowed to see the map of." "So go find the map," Camille said, matter of fact, the way she said most things. "You're literally trained for exactly this. You spend your whole career finding the one document that doesn't fit the story everyone's agreed to tell. Do the same thing for yourself for once." It was such an obvious thing to say that it landed harder than she probably intended. I had spent my entire adult life applying that exact skill everywhere except the one place it might have mattered most to me personally, as though some old, deeply worn habit kept me from turning that same careful attention toward my own family, out of fear, maybe, of what I'd eventually find, or maybe just out of the sheer exhaustion of having done it silently for so long already. We stayed at that table another hour, moving on to easier subjects, a work gossip story that had nothing to do with me. Camille's plans for a trip she was saving up for, some new restaurant neither of us had tried yet that she wanted to drag me to the following month. It was the kind of ordinary, unremarkable conversation that doesn't sound like much afterward, retold, but does more for a person, in the moment, than almost anything else could. I noticed myself laughing more than once. A real laugh, not the polite version I'd gotten so practiced at producing around my own family, and understood, somewhere in the middle of it, how much I'd needed exactly this before I let myself go any further down whatever road Paulette's slip of the tongue was about to lead me down. I walked out into the cool evening afterward feeling, for the first time in what had actually been closer to 2 weeks, something like myself again. June used to say something similar to what Camille had said, in her own plainer way. She used to tell me, when I was small and worried about fitting in somewhere I didn't quite feel I belonged, that a person's worth was never up for a vote. I hadn't thought about that phrase in years. It came back to me clearly, walking to my car under a sky just starting to go dark, and I found myself grateful. in a way that had nothing to do with genealogy or paperwork, for every person in my life who had never once needed proof of anything to treat me like I mattered. Whatever Vivian turned out to be, whoever she was to me or wasn't. I understood, walking home that night, that I already knew who I was without her. I just also, increasingly, wanted to know the truth. 2 weeks after the funeral, with the search for Vivian still sitting cold in the back of my mind, an ordinary piece of paperwork finally caught up with all of it. I had finally saved enough for a down payment on a condominium not far from Camille's place. A modest one-bedroom with good natural light and a kitchen just barely big enough for 2 people to stand in at once. And my mortgage broker had asked for a full set of identity documents to move the pre-approval along. Birth certificate, social security card, and since I'd been adopted as an infant, the original adoption decree, the kind of document I hadn't looked at closely since I was maybe 22 and needed it for a passport renewal. I found it in the fireproof box I kept in my closet and spread it flat on my kitchen table under the lamp I usually used for reading contracts at home. It was exactly what I remembered: a formal decree from the county court, the judge's signature, the court seal, and, in the corner, a notary's stamp confirming the copy as a true and accurate record. I almost didn't look twice at the stamp. In 12 years of examining documents professionally, I had developed the kind of attention that mostly stayed dormant outside of work hours, the way a musician can walk past a badly tuned piano without consciously registering it. But something about the angle of the lamp caught the embossing at just the right slant, and the pattern registered before I'd fully decided to look. The notary seal was wrong. Not fake in any way an untrained eye would catch, but wrong in the specific technical way I would have flagged instantly on any file at Meridian. The border pattern around the seal used a style the state hadn't issued since the late 1980s, a decade or more before this document was supposedly notarized. Seals get updated periodically, and notaries generally use whatever's current. This one didn't match its own claimed date at all. I sat very still at my kitchen table for a long moment, the lamp humming faintly overhead, turning the decree slowly under the light to be sure I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't. I have built an entire career on noticing exactly this kind of small, deliberate inconsistency, the kind most people never think to question because the document looks official enough on its surface. This one looked official. It simply wasn't quite what it claimed to be. I thought briefly about calling the county clerk's office directly and asking someone to explain the discrepancy. I got as far as pulling up the number before stopping myself. This wasn't a client's file. It was mine. And some old instinct warned me not to ask a government office to confirm something about my own paperwork before I understood, first, what I might be asking them to confirm. I didn't yet have any reason to connect it to Paulette, or to the name still sitting on a receipt in my nightstand drawer. A mismatched notary seal on a decades-old adoption decree could mean any number of mundane things: a clerical error, a notary using outdated stock out of simple carelessness, a copy made improperly at some point along the way and never corrected. I told myself that several times in the particular tone I usually reserved for reassuring anxious clients about paperwork that probably wasn't as alarming as it looked. I photographed the seal anyway, the way I'd photograph any anomaly worth flagging, close enough to catch the fine detail of the embossing, and saved it in a folder on my phone I hadn't yet given a name. I finished gathering the rest of the mortgage paperwork, sent it off to my broker the way I'd planned to all along, and told myself the seal was a footnote, a small professional curiosity and nothing more, the kind of thing I'd have flagged and moved past in an ordinary week at the office. My phone rang just as I was closing the fireproof box and sliding it back onto its shelf. Walter's name lit up the screen, which was unusual enough on its own. My father rarely called me directly, preferring texts for anything that wasn't already scheduled. "Nora," he said when I picked up, his voice carrying the particular brisk, business-toned register he used for anything related to Ashford Properties. "Glad I caught you. There's something important I need to talk to you about. Regarding the company's future, I'd like to sit down properly. This week, if you can manage it." I glanced down at my phone, at the photograph of that mismatched seal still sitting open in my gallery, and felt something small and cold settle low in my stomach, a feeling I couldn't yet name or justify with anything concrete. "Of course," I said. "What's this about better in person?" Walter said. "I'll have Diane set something up. It's nothing to worry about, just business." I asked if Diane and Preston would be there too, mostly out of habit, the reflex of someone who had learned long ago to know exactly who would be in a room before walking into it. "Diane, yes. Preston's already read in on most of it," Walter said. "Better everyone hears the same version at once." I agreed to Thursday and hung up feeling that same cold, unnamed thing settle a little deeper. "Everyone hears the same version at once" was not a phrase Walter used lightly. In 20 years of watching him run Ashford Properties from the edges of family dinners, I had learned he only bothered coordinating a unified version of events when he expected somebody might push back on it. Two loose threads now sat in the same small apartment, a name Paulette had nearly let slip, and immediately regretted, and a stamp that didn't match its own paperwork by a decade or more. I had no proof yet that the two were connected. I had, if I was honest, a professional instinct telling me they very likely were. It was, as it turned out, very much something to worry about. I simply had no way of knowing that yet. Standing in my kitchen with a stranger's 40-year-old inconsistency sitting flat on my table, and my father's voice, calm and businesslike, already setting the next one in motion. I want to pause here and tell you something I've come to believe since all of this happened. Small inconsistencies rarely travel alone. A name someone almost says and then swallows. A stamp that doesn't match its own paperwork. On their own, either one is easy to explain away. And for a few days, I tried to do exactly that. I didn't yet know how those two threads connected, or whether they connected at all. I only knew that Thursday was coming, that my father wanted the whole family in one room to hear the same version of something at the same time, and that some old, careful part of me had already started preparing the way I prepared for any closing where the numbers didn't quite add up. I walked into that meeting still telling myself it was probably nothing, the way I'd told myself that about a dozen smaller things already that month. I want you to remember that I believed that, genuinely, right up until the moment Walter set a folder down in front of me and asked me to sign something before I'd even had a chance to read it. The meeting was held in Walter's office at Ashford Properties, not at the house, which should have told me something before I'd even sat down. Family business usually happened around the kitchen table. This was conducted across a conference table, with water glasses set at each place like we were closing on a property rather than discussing something that involved, in theory, nothing but family. Diane sat to Walter's right, hands folded, expression composed in the particular way that meant she'd already rehearsed whatever came next. Preston sat at the far end, scrolling his phone until Walter cleared his throat, at which point he set it face down and straightened up, the posture of someone who already knew the broad strokes and was mostly there to nod along. "Thank you for coming," Walter said, as though I'd had a real choice in the matter. "I wanted to talk to you directly about some changes we're making to the company structure. Preston's taking on full ownership of Ashford Properties over the next 2 quarters. It's time. I'm not getting any younger, And he's been running the day-to-day for years now anyway. That makes sense, I said, and meant it. I had never had any interest in running Ashford Properties, never worked there, never asked to be considered for it. Preston taking the reins was not, in itself, a surprise, and not one I had any objection to. There's a piece of this that involves you, though, Walter continued, and reached for a folder sitting closed on the table in front of him. The family trust that funds part of the company's capital lists you as a partial beneficiary, same as Preston. Standard language from when the trust was set up. Before either of you were adults, legally, that entitles you to a share when the ownership transfers. I felt something shift slightly in my chest. Not quite alarm yet, more a kind of professional attentiveness. The sensation I got at work whenever a conversation started sounding rehearsed. Okay, I said carefully. That sounds like good news. It would be, Walter said, except there's a complication. He opened the folder and slid a single sheet of paper across the table toward me, face up. This came up during the legal review for the transfer. A paternity test, run as part of due diligence on the trust's original beneficiary language. I looked down at the paper. It was formatted like the sort of lab report I'd occasionally seen attached to custody or inheritance disputes at work, complete with a case number, a laboratory letterhead, a series of genetic markers laid out in a table, and, at the bottom, a conclusion stated in flat, clinical language. The tested individual does not share a biological parent-child relationship with the reference sample provided. I don't understand, I said, though some cold professional part of me was already starting to. I'm adopted. Everyone in this room has always known that. Why would a paternity test even be relevant to a trust that names me as an adoptive beneficiary? Because the original trust language was drafted narrowly, Walter said, his voice smooth, rehearsed. The same tone he used for board presentations. It specifies biological or legally verified lineage, not simply adoptive status. Our attorneys flagged it. Given the test results, there's a real legal question about whether you qualify as a beneficiary at all. You're telling me, I said slowly, that a decades-old trust somehow requires a paternity test I never agreed to, that I'm only hearing about today, and that conveniently disqualifies me right as ownership transfers to Preston. It's not convenient, Diane said, speaking for the first time, her voice even. It's simply what the documents say. We didn't write this trust. Nora, we're just following what it requires. I'd like to sign an updated beneficiary form, Walter said, sliding a second document toward me, a longer one this time, formal-looking, with signature lines already flagged with small yellow tabs. It formally acknowledges the test results and removes any ambiguity about your status, so the transfer to Preston can move forward cleanly. It protects everyone, honestly. No one wants this getting messy in probate court somewhere down the line. I sat very still, looking at the two documents in front of me. The same practiced stillness I used at work when a client's story had just stopped adding up. 12 years of examining paperwork for a living had taught me exactly one lesson above all others. Legitimate documents don't usually arrive with their own signature already flagged, and a rushed explanation for why you should sign quickly, before you've had time to read anything closely. I'll need to review this properly before I sign anything, I said, keeping my voice level, professional, the voice I used with difficult clients who wanted things faster than due diligence allowed. This isn't the kind of document you sign on the spot. Something flickered across Walter's face, there and gone fast enough that I might have missed it if I hadn't spent 12 years watching for exactly that kind of flicker in people who didn't want a deal examined too closely. "Of course," he said, recovering smoothly. "Take your time. Just don't take too long. Preston's transition timeline depends on this being settled." I folded both documents carefully and slid them into my bag, thanked them for the meeting in a voice that sounded, even to my own ears, considerably calmer than I felt, and walked out of that office with a stranger's paternity test in my hands and a very clear, very cold certainty settling into place behind my ribs. I had read 1,000 documents in my career designed to make people sign quickly instead of carefully. I had never once expected to be handed one by my own father. I didn't go straight home. I drove to a coffee shop 2 blocks from Meridian instead, somewhere neutral, somewhere that wasn't tied to either version of my life, and spread both documents across a small round table with a cup of coffee going cold beside them. I read the paternity test 3 times. Slowly. The way I'd read any document a client brought in, convinced it proved something it might not actually prove. The formatting was close to right. Whoever had produced this had clearly seen genuine lab reports before, had modeled the layout carefully. The genetic marker table, the case reference number, the disclaimer language along the bottom about chain of custody. It was the kind of forgery built by someone who understood what a real document was supposed to look like, not someone guessing from a television show. But formatting wasn't the only thing I checked for a living. I looked at the lab's letterhead, a name I didn't recognize, and searched it on my phone under the table. The search returned nothing. No address, no website, no state licensing record, nothing at all. Which was strange for a laboratory supposedly certified to run legally significant genetic testing. Real labs doing paternity work for trust and custody purposes carry accreditation that shows up in public databases almost immediately. This one didn't exist anywhere I could find. I thought about the meeting itself while I worked, replaying the specific way Walter's voice had stayed level and rehearsed the entire time. The way Diane had spoken exactly once, a single sentence delivered like a line she'd practiced in the mirror. Preston, at least, had looked genuinely uncomfortable through most of it, shifting in his seat, not quite meeting my eyes when the paternity test came out. Whatever was happening, I didn't think Preston had written the script. I thought he'd simply been handed a part in it, the same way I had, except his part came with an inheritance attached, and mine came with a folder full of reasons to give mine up. I checked the notary stamp next, the one certifying the chain of custody section, and felt something cold settle low in my stomach for the second time in as many weeks. The seal's border pattern looked familiar in a way that had nothing to do with legal notary standards and everything to do with the photograph still sitting in an unnamed folder on my phone. I pulled it up next to the document on the table, angling my phone screen carefully so no one at the neighboring tables could see what I was doing. They matched, not similar, not the same general style, the exact same seal, the exact same outdated border pattern that hadn't been issued by the state since sometime in the late 1980s, appearing now on a paternity test supposedly notarized just weeks earlier. I sat back in my chair, the coffee shop noise around me suddenly distant, muffled. The way sound gets when your attention narrows down to a single point. 2 documents, decades apart in their supposed dates, carrying the identical wrong seal. That wasn't a coincidence. In my professional experience, it almost never was. Coincidences in document fraud tend to be rare in exactly the way most people assume they're common. Forgers reuse tools, reuse templates, reuse the specific stamps and seals they have access to, because sourcing a new one every time is expensive and risky. The same wrong seal on 2 documents separated by 40 years meant, in all likelihood, the same source, or at minimum, the same small, specific channel someone had used more than once. I thought about calling Walter directly, right then, and demanding an explanation. I decided against it almost as quickly as the impulse arrived. If I confronted him with a half-formed theory and no outside confirmation, I risked exactly what he seemed to be counting on: a quick, defensive conversation that ended with pressure to sign something before I understood what I was signing away. What I needed instead was someone who could tell me, professionally and independently, whether I was seeing a real pattern or simply projecting one out of stress and grief and a name I still hadn't managed to place. I thought of Ellen Cho almost immediately. We'd met years earlier at an industry conference on document fraud detection, back when I was still fairly junior, and had stayed loosely in touch since, the kind of professional acquaintance you trade holiday cards with, and occasionally call when a case genuinely stumps you. Ellen ran her own practice now, doing forensic document examination for law firms and the occasional insurance company. The sort of quiet, meticulous work that rarely made headlines, but held up in court when it mattered most. I gathered both documents carefully, slid them back into a plain folder, and sat for another minute with my coffee, now fully cold, turning over exactly how much to tell her and how much, for now, to keep to myself until I understood it better. Some instinct told me to keep the family context vague at first, to present it the way I'd present any anomaly at work, as a technical question rather than a personal one, at least until I had something more solid than a feeling and a matching seal to bring to her. I didn't call Walter that night. Some part of me wanted to demand an explanation immediately, the way anger usually wants things done immediately and badly. I let that part of me sit unanswered instead, packed both documents into my bag, and drove home with the folder on the passenger seat, in exactly the spot where a box of tissues, and then a box holding June's brooch, had written in the weeks before. It was becoming, I noticed distantly, a strange and unwelcome pattern, that particular seat. Ellen called back the next morning while I was still getting ready for work, her voice as brisk and warm as I remembered it from conferences years earlier. "An old colleague with a strange favor," she said. "You've officially made my week more interesting than it was going to be." "What have you got?" I told her, carefully, in the flattened professional language I'd use describing any file, that I'd come across a document I suspected was forged, and that I needed an independent opinion, off the record for now, before I decided how to handle it. I didn't tell her it was a paternity test. I didn't tell her it involved my own father. I wanted her read on the paper itself first, uncolored by the story sitting underneath it. "I can look at it Thursday evening, if that works," she said. "My office. Bring whatever you've got, and anything you think might be related. Sometimes the interesting part isn't the document someone hands you, it's the other document sitting next to it that nobody thought to ask about." I thought immediately of the adoption decree, still sitting in its fireproof box, and of the photograph on my phone. I might have something like that, actually. Even better. Bring it all. Thursday evening. I sat across a wide, well-lit table in Ellen's small office, watching her work with the particular unhurried precision I remembered from years earlier. A jeweler's loupe pressed to one eye as she examined the paternity test under a strong desk lamp, turning it slowly, angle by angle. "Where did this come from?" she asked, not looking up. "A family matter," I said. "I'd rather not say more yet. I want your honest read first," she nodded, unbothered by the vagueness, the way professionals in her field generally were. Ellen had told me once, years ago, over drinks at that same conference, that context could bias an examiner as easily as it could help one, and that she preferred, when possible, to let the paper speak before she let the story around it start shaping her conclusions. I remembered thinking, at the time, that it was an unusually disciplined way to approach a job most people assumed was mostly about matching handwriting samples. I understood it better now. Sitting across from her with a story I very much wanted her to reach independently, rather than one I'd handed her already assembled. Her office was small and unfussy. A single wide desk, a wall of reference binders organized by year and jurisdiction, a good north-facing window that let in clean, even light without any glare. It looked like the kind of room built entirely around the act of looking closely at things, which, I supposed, was exactly what it was. She was quiet for a long few minutes, moving from the lab letterhead to the genetic marker table to the notary seal at the bottom, occasionally making a small note on a legal pad beside her. "A few things jump out immediately," she said finally, setting the loop down. "The letterhead's clean, professionally produced, but I can't find any record of this laboratory holding accreditation anywhere I'd expect to see it. That alone isn't conclusive. Smaller labs sometimes slip through database gaps. But combined with this," she tapped the notary seal, "I'm fairly confident already that we're looking at a fabricated document. This seal design was retired by the state a long time ago. I'd need to check my references to give you an exact year, but it's well out of date for a document claiming to be notarized recently." How confident is fairly confident, enough that I wouldn't hesitate to say so in a preliminary opinion. For anything I'd put my name on formally, in something like a court filing, I'd want more time, cross-referencing, maybe a second opinion from a colleague who specializes specifically in seal dating. But informally, between us, I'd bet my professional reputation this document was never processed by any real notary, current or retired. She looked up at me for the first time since starting. "Nora, I have to ask, is this connected to something that could end up in a legal proceeding?" "I honestly don't know yet," I said, which was, at that point, entirely true. That's part of why I need to understand it properly before I do anything else. I reached into my bag and pulled out the photograph on my phone, the close-up of the seal from my own adoption decree, and set it on the table beside the paternity test. "One more thing. I want to know if these two seals match." Ellen picked up her loupe again, moved between the photograph and the physical document in front of her, and went quiet for a much longer stretch this time. Long enough that I found myself holding my breath without quite deciding to. "They match," she said finally, sitting back. "Same border pattern, same proportions, same specific styling on the eagle at the center. I'd want the original document itself, not just a photograph to make it fully rigorous, but visually, these are the same seal, or seals produced from the same die." She looked at me carefully. The way I imagined she looked at clients right before delivering news that mattered. "Where's this other document from my adoption decree?" I said. "From 40 years ago." Ellen set the loop down slowly, and for a moment, neither of us said anything at all. "I'd like the physical originals," she said finally, her voice gentler now than the brisk, professional tone she'd used through most of the evening. "Both of them. If what I'm seeing holds up under full examination. Nora, this isn't a one-time forgery. This is a pattern, and patterns like that don't usually happen by accident." I handed Ellen both original documents that same evening, watched her seal them carefully into individually labeled envelopes with a chain of custody form I recognized instinctively from my own line of work, and drove home with empty hands for the first time in weeks, the strange, hollow feeling of having given something important to someone else to hold. The waiting started the next morning, and it did not start quietly. Walter texted first, a little after 8, his message brisk and businesslike as always. "Following up on our conversation, Any progress reviewing the documents, Preston's timeline is tighter than I'd like, and I'd rather not have this drag into next quarter. I told him, honestly enough, that I was still reviewing everything carefully and would follow up soon. It wasn't a lie. I simply left out exactly what careful review had already turned up. Diane called that afternoon, which was, on its own, unusual enough to make me set down what I was doing and actually pay attention. Diane rarely called. She preferred texts, brief and efficient, the same way she preferred most things in her life managed at a comfortable distance. "I wanted to check in," she said, her voice pleasant in the specific, effortful way that meant she was working at it. "Your father can be a little impatient about deadlines. I know this is a lot to take in." "It is," I said, keeping my own voice equally even. "I appreciate you checking in. I just don't want this to become more complicated than it needs to be," Diane said. "For anyone. The sooner it's settled, the sooner everyone can move forward, you included." What exactly would I be moving forward from, I asked, and heard, on the other end of the line. A very brief, very telling pause before she answered. "From all of this uncertainty," she said. "It isn't good for anyone, dragging things out." I let the silence sit a beat longer than was comfortable, an old habit from work. The kind of pause that sometimes made people fill the space with more than they intended to say. Diane didn't take the bait. She simply waited it out, which told me something on its own, since Diane rarely had that kind of patience for silence unless she deliberately decided to exercise it. "I'll have an answer soon," I said finally. "I'm not going to rush something this significant." "Of course," Diane said, and I could hear, underneath the pleasant tone, something tighter than the version of her I'd spoken with 2 weeks earlier on June's back patio. The one who had, for once, told me something true, without needing to be pushed into it. We hung up a few minutes later, and I sat at my kitchen table turning the conversation over, the way I turned over most conversations lately, looking for the seam where the performance met the reality underneath it. I hadn't expected, of all things, to miss that steadier version of Diane quite this quickly, or to notice how clearly the difference between the two versions of her had come into focus in the space of 2 short weeks. My phone buzzed again before I'd fully finished the thought. Preston. This time. A message far shorter and less careful than either of his parents. "Hey, sorry about all this. Just want it settled so we can all move on. Nothing personal." I read it twice, trying to decide whether nothing personal was meant as reassurance or as a quiet admission that he understood. On some level, exactly how personal it actually was. I didn't answer right away. Diane had never, in 40 years, pushed me toward anything with this particular urgency. Not toward college applications, not toward career decisions, not toward anything that actually mattered to my life. Her involvement in my choices had always been characterized by a kind of careful distance, present enough to comment, absent enough to avoid responsibility if the comment turned out wrong. This was different. This was someone actively steering, and steering hard, toward an outcome that happened to strip me of a share in a company transfer worth, by even a conservative estimate, several $1,000,000. I thought about Walter's text again, too. The specific phrasing he'd used. "Preston's timeline is tighter than I'd like. Not our timeline. Not the family's timeline. Preston's. As though the entire structure of pressure existed purely in service of one outcome, getting Preston into full, uncontested ownership, as quickly and cleanly as possible, with as few loose threads as the paperwork could manage. I didn't yet understand why removing me specifically mattered so much. Beyond the obvious financial motive sitting on the surface, millions of dollars was reason enough for most people. I knew that. But something in the tightness of Diane's voice, the specific effort it had clearly cost her to sound merely concerned rather than urgent, suggested there was a second layer underneath the first one, something beyond simple money, something closer to fear. I didn't have proof of that yet. I only had instinct, the same instinct that had never once, in 12 years of examining fraudulent paperwork, been entirely wrong about when a client was hiding something bigger than the number on the page in front of them. I spent that evening doing the one thing that had always steadied me. When a case at work refused to resolve cleanly, I wrote it all down. Plainly. The way I'd document a file for underwriting. The trinket dish. The word Paulette had almost said and swallowed. The mismatched seal on my adoption decree, the fabricated laboratory, the identical seal on Walter's paternity test, Diane's unusual urgency, Preston's careful, apologetic distance. Laid out in a list like that, stripped of the emotion each individual moment had carried at the time, the pattern looked less like a string of unrelated family friction and more like exactly what my professional training told me it probably was: a coordinated effort, sustained over time, by more than one person, to keep something specific buried. I didn't yet know what that something was, but I closed the laptop that night with a very different question in mind than the one I'd started the week with. It was no longer only what happened to me. It had become who else this had happened to, and how far back it actually went. The next few days moved at the strange, doubled pace grief and suspicion tend to create together. Ordinary hours at Meridian stretched thin over a private investigation running underneath them the whole time. I used my lunch breaks to dig into public filings on Ashford properties, the kind of research that felt uncomfortably close to my actual job. Except this time the subject of the file was my own family. Ashford Properties was a mid-sized firm, privately held mostly commercial development and property management across 3 counties, the sort of company that never made headlines but had, over 3 decades, accumulated a solid and genuinely valuable portfolio. What caught my attention wasn't the portfolio itself, it was the timing. County filings showed Ashford Properties had, over the past 18 months, been quietly restructuring its ownership documents in preparation for what the paperwork described only as a generational transfer. Refinanced loans, updated corporate bylaws, a revised operating agreement that, buried on page 11 in language dense enough that most people would skim straight past it, specified exactly the kind of beneficiary language Walter had mentioned in his office: biological or legally verified lineage required for any party claiming inherited interest. I read the clause 3 times over, the way I read anything at work that seemed engineered to be skimmed past rather than understood. Trusts I'd examined professionally almost never specified biological lineage with this kind of precision, unless a lawyer had been paid specifically to close a loophole someone was worried about. Broad language protected families. Narrow language protected outcomes. I sat with that phrase for a long time. Trusts get drafted with all kinds of language, some of it careless, some of it deliberate. But this particular clause, specifying biological lineage so precisely, in a document revised recently enough to still smell faintly of fresh printer toner when I'd requested the copy, didn't read like an old oversight nobody had bothered to update. It read like something added. I pulled the revision history, a feature of the county's digital filing system most people never bothered checking, and found what I was looking for without much difficulty. The operating agreement had been amended 4 months earlier. 4 months earlier. Which put it, by my rough count, right around the same window Evelyn had mentioned weeks before. The timing Paulette's own reaction seemed to confirm without either of us saying so directly. Something had happened 4 months ago. Something had changed the family's paperwork. And not long after, changed the story they were telling about who I was. I thought about Paulette's outburst at June's house. Months after that quiet legal shift, but still close enough in the timeline that it felt less like an old grudge resurfacing on its own, and more like something newly disturbed, unsettled by whatever had happened in the background that none of us had been told about directly. I ran a conservative estimate of what my share of the transfer would represent, based on the portfolio value listed in the filings and the beneficiary percentages named in the trust's original language. The language Walter's attorneys were apparently working so hard to reinterpret out of existence. The number that came back was not small. It was the kind of number that explained, on its own, why someone might be motivated to produce a forged document, rather than simply have an honest conversation about a will. It didn't explain everything, though. Money alone rarely does, in my experience, not fully. Money explains why someone might cut a corner they'd otherwise have left alone. It explains less well why an entire coordinated effort, spanning at least one forged laboratory report, a fabricated notary seal used identically 40 years apart, and a carefully rehearsed unified story from 3 separate family members, would be built around erasing my legal identity rather than simply negotiating a smaller settlement, or buying me out quietly, or any of a dozen less extreme paths that would have accomplished roughly the same financial outcome with far less risk. People do not usually reach for the most extreme, most legally dangerous option available to them unless the less extreme options threaten to expose something they need kept hidden even more than they need the money. I closed my laptop that evening with the distinct, uncomfortable sense that I had been looking at this from the wrong end the entire time. I had been asking why Walter wanted to remove me from the trust. I hadn't yet asked the better question, what, specifically, would keeping me in it eventually force into the open? My phone buzzed just as I was packing up to leave the coffee shop where I'd spent the last 2 hours cross-referencing filings. A text from Ellen. "Call me when you have 5 minutes. Nothing urgent. Just want to update you." I called her from my car in the parking lot, the engine off, the evening going dim around me. "I don't have the full, formal report ready yet," Ellen said, "but I wanted you to hear this from me directly rather than read it cold in a document later. I've confirmed the seal match at a level I'd be comfortable testifying to, if it ever came to that. Same die, same document mill. In all likelihood, used 40 years apart." A pause. Brief, but deliberate. "Nora, I need to ask you something, and I need you to actually think about it before you answer. Is there any chance this involves more than just your own paperwork? Any chance there are other people out there who might have been affected by whatever produced these documents?" I sat in my dark car for a long moment before I answered, turning the question over the way I'd turn over any conclusion I wasn't quite ready to reach. "I don't know yet," I said finally. "But I'm starting to think the answer might be yes." Ellen's formal report arrived 6 days later, delivered in person rather than by email, which told me something about how seriously she'd ended up taking it before I'd even opened the envelope. We met at her office again, the same wide, well-lit table, except this time she had a bound document waiting for me, her letterhead across the top, her signature and license number at the bottom. The kind of report built to hold up somewhere far more formal than a family kitchen table. "I'll walk you through the summary first," she said, sliding the report across to me. "And then you can read the technical detail on your own time, Short version, both the notary seal on the paternity test and the notary seal on your adoption decree are forged. Not similar, not stylistically related. Forged from what I'm now confident is the same physical die, or an extremely precise reproduction of it, used at 2 points in time, separated by roughly 4 decades. I stared at the page in front of me. The phrase forged from the same physical die printed in plain, clinical type, so much smaller and quieter on the page than it felt sitting across from her. "There's more," Ellen said. I ran the laboratory letterhead on the paternity test through a database I have access to, one that tracks known fraudulent document templates used in custody and inheritance disputes going back a couple of decades. I got a partial match. Not the lab name itself, that appears to have been invented specifically for this document, but the formatting, the specific font choices, the layout of the genetic marker table. It's consistent with templates I've seen flagged before in cases involving disputed inheritance in this state. Disputed by who? That's the part I can't tell you, Ellen said. The database I'm referencing protects the identity of the original cases, unless there's an active legal proceeding requesting the information. But I can tell you the pattern isn't unique to your family. Whoever produced this document, or whoever they learned the template from, has done this kind of thing before. More than once. Most likely. I sat back in my chair. The coffee I hadn't touched yet going cold beside me for the second time in as many meetings with Ellen. I found myself thinking, absurdly, of the strip mall fraud file still technically open on my own desk at Meridian. A seller who'd forged one signature, one time, out of impatience with probate. That case had felt significant to me a few weeks earlier. It felt almost quaint now, measured against whatever this actually was. More than once. Not a single isolated act of desperation by one frightened man trying to protect his son's inheritance. A pattern, a method. Possibly, though I still had no way to confirm it. A service someone had used before, for someone else, for reasons I couldn't begin to guess at yet. "What do I do with this?" I asked, and meant it as an honest question rather than a rhetorical one. Ellen considered it for a moment. "Professionally speaking, that's really up to you. I can tell you what the document shows. I can't tell you what's right for your family, or what you're prepared to have happen once this becomes formal instead of private. A report like this, once it's shared with an attorney or a court, tends to take on momentum of its own. It stops being something you control entirely." I thought about Walter's careful, rehearsed tone in his office. I thought about Diane's uncharacteristic urgency on the phone. The fear underneath the politeness she hadn't quite managed to smooth all the way over. I thought about Paulette, in her front hallway, gardening gloves still on, refusing to finish a sentence that had started with a name I still knew almost nothing about. "I need a little more time," I said finally. "Not to decide whether this is real. I believe you completely. I need time to understand what it connects to before I hand it to someone whose job is just to win, rather than to understand." Ellen nodded. Unsurprised. The reaction of someone who had clearly watched other clients arrive at that same fork in the road before. "That's fair. Just don't wait too long. Documents like this have a way of getting more dangerous to sit on the longer certain people suspect you're sitting on them." She hesitated, then added more gently. "For what it's worth, whoever built this, they were careful. Careful people don't usually stop on their own. Something eventually makes them stop. I'd rather that something be you, on your own timeline, than an accident nobody saw coming. I left her office with the report tucked carefully into my bag, the same bag that had carried a fabricated paternity test, an adoption decree, and, weeks earlier, a small wooden box holding a silver brooch shaped like a sprig of lily of the valley. It was, I thought on the drive home, a strange inventory for one ordinary tote bag to be carrying through a single autumn. Proof of a lie 40 years old. Proof of the one person in that family who had never lied to me at all. I didn't yet know how to find whoever had built that lie in the first place. I only knew, driving home under a sky just beginning to darken, that I had run out of reasons to keep pretending I could solve this quietly, alone, without help from somewhere outside the family I'd spent my whole life trying to belong to. I spent the following weekend trying to trace the seal itself, working the problem the way I would any file where the paper trail had gone cold at both ends. Notary seals in this state are registered against a specific commission, tied to a specific person, valid for a fixed term before renewal. If I could identify whose commission had originally used that exact seal design, I'd have a name, a real one. Not a guess or a hunch. Something Ellen's report could eventually be matched against. The state's notary commission database only went back electronically 25 years, which put my adoption decree, 40 years old, outside its reach entirely. I called the county clerk's office instead, gave them the approximate date range, and was told, politely but firmly, that older commission records existed only on microfiche, stored off-site, and that pulling them required a formal records request that could take anywhere from several weeks to several months depending on staffing. I filed the request anyway. I had learned over 12 years in this line of work that slow official channels were still channels, and that a formal paper trail, however delayed, tended to hold up better later than anything gathered informally. In the meantime, I tried a different angle. I pulled every publicly available filing I could find that referenced Ashford properties across the decades, looking for any notary's name that appeared more than once, any small, recurring signature that might connect one era to another. It was tedious work, the kind that filled an entire Saturday with nothing to show for it but a spreadsheet full of names that led nowhere. Notaries long retired, notaries who died years earlier. One notary whose license, according to a state disciplinary record I found almost by accident, had been revoked decades ago for reasons the record didn't specify beyond a single flagged code. I stared at that entry for a long time. A revoked license, unspecified reasons. Sometime in the same general era, my adoption decree had supposedly been notarized. It was suggestive. It was not proof. I wrote the name down anyway, in the same growing document where I'd started keeping everything and kept digging, hoping for something that would connect that name directly to my family, rather than simply existing in the same general neighborhood of time and geography. I tried calling the state disciplinary board directly on Monday during my lunch break, hoping someone could tell me, informally at least, what the flagged code next to that revoked license actually meant. The clerk who answered was polite and entirely unhelpful, explaining that disciplinary details from that era predated the board's current digital system, and that anything further would require, again, a formal written request. This one routed through an entirely different office than the one already processing my records request for the notary commission. I wrote down the new address, added it to my growing list of slow, official channels, and tried not to feel the particular kind of fatigue that comes from doing everything correctly and still being told to wait. I found nothing more that weekend. By Sunday evening, I had a folder full of dead ends, a formal records request that wouldn't produce anything for weeks at the earliest, and a single flagged name with no confirmed connection to anyone I actually knew. I sat at my kitchen table that evening, more frustrated than I'd let myself be in weeks, and allowed myself, briefly, to feel the full weight of it. I was 40 years old. I had a good job, a new condominium I was genuinely excited about. Friends who loved me without conditions attached. And somewhere underneath all of that sat a hole in my own history that I couldn't seem to dig toward, no matter which direction I tried approaching it from. It would have been easy that particular evening to set the whole thing down. Ellen had already confirmed enough. Technically, to prove the paternity test was fraudulent. That alone was sufficient to stop Walter and Diane's attempt to push me out of the trust. I didn't strictly need to know who Vivian was, or why a decades-old notary seal had resurfaced on a document engineered to disinherit me, in order to protect what was legally mine. But knowing that didn't make the not knowing sit any easier. I thought about June, about the brooch sitting on my dresser, about the specific, deliberate way she'd made sure I received it regardless of anything Paulette or anyone else decided to say about where I belonged. June had never needed proof to know exactly who I was to her. I found myself wondering, sitting there with a folder full of dead ends, whether that unconditional certainty was something I'd have to learn to extend to myself, too, whether or not the paperwork ever fully cooperated. I called Camille before bed, mostly just to hear a familiar voice after a weekend that had felt unusually solitary even by my own standards. I didn't go into the details, not the notary names or the revoked license or the formal requests now sitting in 2 separate government queues. I just told her I was tired, in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, and she didn't push for more than that, which was, as always, exactly what I needed from her in that moment. I decided that night that I would keep pulling the thread regardless of how slowly it moved, not because I needed the answer to feel whole, because somewhere out there, if Ellen was right, there might be someone else this had happened to. Someone who hadn't had the particular, unlikely advantage. I'd had a career spent learning exactly how to spot the kind of lie that hides in plain sight, dressed up in official letterhead, waiting for nobody to look closely enough to notice. I called Walter the following Tuesday and asked to meet him alone. Without Diane, without Preston, without the conference table and the water glasses arranged like a closing. He suggested his study at the house instead, which surprised me slightly until I realized it was probably the one room in that house where Diane rarely spent much time. He was sitting behind his desk when I arrived, reading glasses pushed up into his hair, a stack of unrelated paperwork spread in front of him that he didn't bother clearing away, as though this conversation didn't warrant his full attention until I proved otherwise. The study smelled the same way it always had. Old books and the particular brand of pipe tobacco he'd quit smoking decades ago but somehow never stopped leaving the scent of behind. A room that had always felt, to me, like the one place in that house where Walter got to be entirely himself, away from Diane's careful management of every other room's atmosphere. I set Ellen's report down on top of his paperwork without preamble. I had the paternity test examined, I said, independently by a forensic document examiner with real credentials, the kind that hold up in court. It's forged. So is the notary seal on it. And that same forged seal, Walter, the exact same one, was used on my original adoption decree 40 years ago. I watched his face carefully while I said it, the way I'd watch a client's face when I laid out an inconsistency they hadn't expected me to catch. Something moved behind his eyes, quick and unmistakable, gone almost as fast as it appeared. Not confusion, recognition. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but the words came out a half-second too slow. missing the easy, rehearsed cadence he'd used in his office 2 weeks earlier. "I think you do," I said. "I think you've known this whole time that the paternity test wasn't real. I think the only real question is whether you knew about the other one, too. The one from 40 years ago." Walter took his glasses off entirely, set them on the desk, and rubbed at the bridge of his nose in a gesture I recognized from childhood. The one that meant he was buying time rather than actually thinking. "You don't understand the position I'm in," he said finally. "Then explain it to me." "It's not that simple." "Nora, it's a yes or no question." "Walter, did you know the test was fake when you handed it to me?" He didn't answer right away, and in the silence that followed, I understood, with a kind of cold clarity, that the silence itself was the answer. "There are things," he said slowly, choosing each word with visible effort, "that were decided a long time ago, before you'd understand any of it, before I fully understood all of it myself, if I'm honest." He looked up at me, and for just a moment, the careful business mask slipped enough that I saw something underneath it that looked almost like fear. "Some of this isn't mine to explain. There are things better left buried. Nora, you don't know what you'd be digging up." "That's not an answer either. It's the only one I can give you right now." "Whose choice was it originally?" I asked, thinking of Paulette's hallway. Of the same evasive shape to a very similar conversation. "Because you keep saying it's not yours to explain. So whose is it?" Walter's jaw tightened, the same reflexive motion Paulette's had made weeks earlier. And for a moment I thought he might actually answer. Instead he stood, moved to the window, and stood with his back to me for a long moment before speaking again. "Talk to your mother," he said finally, quietly, not turning around. "I mean that as an instruction, not a deflection. There are parts of this that are genuinely hers to explain, not mine. I've said more than I meant to already. Walter, I need you to leave it there for tonight," he said, and something in his voice had gone thin, almost pleading, nothing like the smooth, rehearsed authority he'd used across the conference table. "Please, I'm asking you." I stood there a moment longer, Ellen's report still sitting on top of his paperwork, unclaimed, unanswered, and understood that I wasn't going to get anything further out of him that evening. Whatever he knew, whatever he'd agreed to years ago and was only now, apparently, starting to question the wisdom of, he had just handed me, without quite meaning to, the clearest confirmation yet of where the center of this actually sat. Not with Walter. Walter was frightened. And increasingly, I thought, genuinely uncertain of his own footing in whatever arrangement this had originally been. Diane had built this. Diane, who had handed me a small wooden box on a quiet patio and, for one unguarded moment, told me something true. Diane, who had also, apparently, spent 40 years making sure I never learned the rest of it. I gathered the report, thanked him for his time in a voice that sounded strange and formal even to my own ears, and left without saying anything more, already turning over exactly how I intended to ask my mother the question my father had just refused to answer for me. Driving home, I found myself replaying not the parts of the conversation where Walter had deflected, but the one moment he hadn't the flicker of fear when I first said the word forged, before he'd had time to compose himself into denial. Fear, not guilt exactly, or not only guilt. Fear reads differently on a person's face than shame does. In my experience, shame tends to look inward, toward the person feeling it. Fear looks outward, toward whatever it is that person is afraid of. Walter hadn't looked like a man ashamed of what he'd done. He'd looked, for that one unguarded second, like a man afraid of what would happen if the wrong person found out he'd let it happen at all. I wanted very badly, driving through streets that had gone dark while I was inside that study, to know exactly who that wrong person was, and why, after 40 years, my father had suddenly started looking so much more afraid of her than of me. I didn't call Diane that night, or the next one either. I told myself I needed time to prepare the conversation properly, the way I'd prepare for any difficult meeting at work. But the truth, when I finally admitted it to myself, was simpler and less flattering. I was afraid of what she'd say, or worse, afraid of what she wouldn't. I spent that Friday evening at Camille's apartment instead, sitting cross-legged on her couch with a glass of wine I mostly wasn't drinking, working through the whole tangled mess out loud for the first time from start to finish. Camille listened the way she always did, quiet and attentive, only interrupting twice, both times to ask a sharp, useful question rather than to fill the silence with sympathy I hadn't asked for. "So Walter basically confirmed it," she said. When I finished, without confirming it. That's the exact phrase I've been using in my head. Confirmed without confirming. "And he sent you to Diane." "He did." Camille was quiet for a moment, turning her own wineglass slowly by the stem. "Can I say something you might not want to hear?" "You're going to say it either way, so go ahead. You've spent this whole thing treating it like a case file, which, honestly, I get. It's probably the only way you've been able to function through it without falling apart. But at some point, Nora, this stops being a document you're examining professionally and starts being your actual life, your actual mother. Whatever she did, or didn't do, you're allowed to feel something messier about it than just curiosity." I sat with that for a while, turning it over the way I'd turn over any observation that landed closer to true than I wanted it to. "I don't know how to do messier," I admitted finally. "I don't think I ever learned how. Every time something hurt in that house growing up, the response that got rewarded was calm, reasonable, don't make a scene. So I got very good at not making one, even internally, even when nobody else was watching." "I know," Camille said, gently. "I've watched you do it for 9 years. I just don't want you walking into whatever conversation you're about to have with Diane so busy being reasonable that you don't let yourself actually react to whatever she tells you." We sat with that for a while, the easy, comfortable quiet of two people who didn't need to fill every silence with talking. Camille eventually changed the subject, on purpose, I think, steering us toward something lighter. A ridiculous story about a coworker's disastrous attempt at a surprise office party that had ended with a rented popcorn machine catching fire in the break room. And I let myself laugh, genuinely, for the first time in what felt like a very long stretch of days. It struck me, laughing at a story that had nothing to do with any of it, how rarely I let myself do that anymore. How much of my energy over the past weeks had gone into staying composed, staying analytical, treating every new discovery as data to be filed rather than grief to be felt. Camille had built an entire evening without ever announcing that's what she was doing, specifically to remind me that both things could exist in the same life at once, the terrible, unresolved thing sitting underneath everything, and an ordinary Friday night with someone who loved me, popcorn machines and all. It was. I realized somewhere in the middle of that laughter, exactly what June used to do for me too, in her own quieter way. She never lectured me about the family's dynamics, never told me directly that I deserved better treatment than I was getting. She simply, consistently, made me feel like a whole person in the room with her, undamaged, unquestioned, worthy of the same easy warmth she extended to everyone else. I hadn't fully understood, until sitting on Camille's couch that evening, how much I'd been quietly starving for exactly that kind of unconditional room to just be, rather than to perform being fine. I stayed at Camille's later than I meant to, past the point where either of us had anything urgent left to say, simply because leaving felt, for once, less appealing than staying somewhere I didn't have to hold myself quite so carefully together. Driving home well after midnight, the city quiet around me, I found myself thinking not about Diane, or Walter, or the forged seal, or any of the tangled threads I'd spent weeks pulling at. I thought about June's wind chime on that back patio, the same 4 notes turning over and over in the evening air, indifferent and steady. The way some things simply keep being true regardless of what else falls apart around them. I decided, somewhere on that quiet drive home, that I was ready to call my mother. Not because I'd stopped being afraid of the answer, because I'd finally let myself admit that being afraid of it wasn't a good enough reason to keep waiting. I let myself feel, for the length of that drive, everything I'd been keeping carefully filed away under professional composure. Anger, yes, but grief, too. Older and larger than I'd expected. Grief for a version of my childhood I was starting to suspect had never existed quite the way I'd always assumed it had. I didn't try to organize any of it into a spreadsheet or a timeline. I just let it sit in the car with me, unresolved and unruly, the way Camille had gently suggested I finally allow it to. By the time I pulled into my own driveway, something in my chest had loosened that I hadn't fully realized was clenched. I wasn't ready for every answer Diane might give me. I was, for the first time since June's funeral, ready to actually ask the question and hear whatever came back, messy or not. I called Diane on Sunday afternoon from my own kitchen table, Ellen's report, and both original documents laid out in front of me the way I'd lay out evidence for a difficult client conversation at work. Everything organized, nothing left to memory. She picked up on the 3rd ring. "Nora? Everything all right? I talked to Walter," I said, skipping past the small talk entirely. "He told me to talk to you. Said there were things that were, and I'm quoting him directly, yours to explain, not his." There was a pause on the line, brief but unmistakable, the kind of pause I'd come to recognize as the sound of someone recalculating. "He shouldn't have said that," Diane said finally, her voice carefully even. "Why not? If it's true, Nora, I don't know what you think this is about, but I know the paternity test is fake," I said, cutting through what I could already tell was going to be a long, practiced deflection. "I know the notary seal on it is forged. I know that same seal was used on my adoption decree 40 years ago. I have a certified forensic report confirming all of it. So please, don't tell me you don't know what I think this is about. I think we both know exactly what this is about." The silence that followed lasted long enough that I checked my phone screen to make sure the call hadn't dropped. I pictured her, somewhere across town in that immaculate kitchen, standing very still the way she always did when a situation refused to move in the direction she'd planned for it. One hand probably braced against the counter, composing herself before she let another word out. "You don't understand the situation you'd be opening up," Diane said finally, her voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier composure. "There are people who would be hurt, badly, people who don't deserve that, after everything, Diane, who would be hurt. I can't. You can't, or you won't. Does it matter which something sharp entered her voice then? An old defensiveness I recognized from a lifetime of smaller disagreements. The tone she used when she'd decided a conversation was over whether or not the other person agreed. I have spent 40 years protecting this family. Nora. All of it. Every part of it. You don't know what that's cost me. You forged my adoption paperwork, I said, keeping my own voice level even as something cold settled deeper into my chest with every word she wasn't quite saying. That's not protecting a family. That's building one on a lie and calling it love. You don't know the whole story. Then tell me the whole story. I can't, she said again. And this time her voice cracked slightly around the word, the first genuine fracture I'd heard in it since this entire conversation began. Not like this. Not over the phone. Please, Nora, give me time. I need to think about how to what? How to manage this the way you've managed everything else. That's not fair. Isn't it? I asked, and heard my own voice go very quiet, very steady, in a way that frightened me slightly. The particular calm I recognized from the worst moments at work, the ones where the stakes had gotten too large for ordinary reactions to hold. You've had 40 years to tell me the truth, Diane. You've had 4 months, at minimum, since whatever happened that made you decide I needed to be erased from a trust instead. I don't think I owe you any more time to figure out how to phrase it. She didn't answer that. I listened to her breathing on the other end of the line, uneven, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful after weeks of confusion, that I wasn't going to get the truth from her voluntarily. Not that day, maybe not ever. Not without something forcing her hand the way nothing in 40 years apparently had. I have to go, Diane said finally, her voice small in a way I had genuinely never heard it before. Not once, in my entire life. I need to think. The line went dead before I could respond. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time afterward. The report and both documents still spread in front of me, and made a decision I'd been circling for days without quite letting myself land on it directly. I wasn't going to solve this quietly, inside the family, waiting for someone who'd kept a secret for 40 years to suddenly find the courage to volunteer it. Whatever this was, whoever else it touched. It had moved beyond what I could untangle with patience and careful questions alone. I opened my laptop and searched, for the first time, not for Vivian, not for old notary commissions, but for the name of the state agency responsible for investigating fraud involving vital records and inheritance documents. I found a number, a general fraud reporting line, and sat looking at it for a long moment before I finally, deliberately, wrote it down. Whatever Diane had built, whatever it had cost her to maintain for 4 decades, I understood, closing my laptop that night, that I was no longer willing to let it stay buried simply because unearthing it might be inconvenient for the people who'd buried it in the first place, I thought. Before I turned off the light that night, about the word Diane kept reaching for. Protecting. She'd said it twice, and clearly meant it, in whatever internal logic had let her live with this for 40 years, sitting there in the dark. I understood the word for what it actually was. Not protection, erasure, dressed up carefully enough that even the person doing it might have believed. Some mornings, it was something else entirely. I didn't call the fraud line that night. It was late, and some decisions deserved to be made in daylight, with a clear head, rather than at midnight running on adrenaline and 40 years of accumulated hurt. But I left the number sitting open on my laptop screen when I finally went to bed. A small, deliberate reminder that morning would not be an excuse to talk myself out of it. I called the fraud line the next morning, before I'd even finished my coffee, before I could talk myself into waiting one more day. I want to tell you that decision felt heroic. It didn't. It felt like stepping off a ledge I'd been standing on for weeks, not knowing whether anything below would actually catch me, or whether I'd just spend the rest of my life falling through a version of my own history nobody had ever intended me to see, dragging my whole family down with me into whatever this actually turned out to be. I didn't know yet that the call would lead, eventually, to a woman I had never met, a woman who had spent 40 years being told the exact same lie about me that I had just spent weeks being told about her. I only knew, hanging up after being told someone would follow up within the week, that there was no walking this back now. Whatever Diane had spent 4 decades protecting, I had just handed the first real threat of it to someone whose entire job was to pull, patiently and without apology, until the whole thing finally came undone. The call came 4 days later, not from the general fraud line I'd originally dialed, but from a direct number I didn't recognize. Nora Ashford. This is Detective Renata Ruiz, Financial Crimes and Vital Records Fraud Unit. I'm calling about the report you filed earlier this week. I sat down slowly at my desk at Meridian, closing the file I'd been working on, some distant part of my brain registering that this was the first time in weeks a phone call about any of this had come from someone with actual authority to do something about it, rather than someone I was simply hoping might eventually help. "Thank you for calling," I said. I wasn't sure how quickly something like this would move. Normally, honestly, it wouldn't move this fast, Ruiz said, her voice brisk, businesslike, entirely unlike the careful, managed tones I'd grown so used to from my own family over the past several weeks. "But your report flagged something that connected to a case already open in our unit. I'd like to meet in person, if you're available this week. There's a fair amount I can share with you now, and probably more I'll be able to share once you and I have talked." "A case already open," I repeated, "meaning this isn't new to you." "I can't get into details over the phone," Ruiz said. "But no, it isn't new. We agreed to meet 2 days later, at a small diner near the courthouse rather than at her office, which she explained when I asked, was mostly a matter of comfort rather than procedure. People tended to talk more freely somewhere that didn't feel like an interrogation room, she said, and in cases involving family, comfort mattered more than people expected. I appreciated the honesty of that answer more than I expected to. 12 years of examining documents for a living had taught me that the people who explained their methods plainly, without needing to perform authority, were usually the ones who actually knew what they were doing. I spent the 2 days in between in a strange, suspended state, unable to fully concentrate at work, unable to stop replaying every version of what Ruiz might tell me. I didn't call Walter. I didn't call Diane. Some instinct told me that whatever I was about to learn needed to reach me first, uncolored by whatever version of it either of them might try to shape in advance. I told Camille only that I had a meeting coming up that might finally answer some of the bigger questions, and let her hold that uncertainty with me over the phone one evening without pushing for more detail than I was ready to give. She didn't ask twice. She simply told me to call her the second it was over, whatever time of night that turned out to be. And I promised I would. Ruiz was already seated in a corner booth when I arrived, a manila folder closed in front of her. A cup of coffee she hadn't touched. She was younger than I'd pictured from her voice, maybe mid-40s, with the kind of unhurried, watchful stillness I recognized from the best examiners I'd worked alongside over the years. People who'd learned that patience uncovered far more than urgency ever did. She stood briefly to shake my hand before I sat, a small, old-fashioned courtesy that somehow made the whole encounter feel less clinical than I'd braced myself for on the drive over. "Thank you for coming," she said, gesturing for me to sit. "I know this can't be an easy few weeks." "It's been a strange few weeks," I said, which felt, even as I said it, like an almost comically small way to describe everything that had happened since June's funeral. Ruiz opened the folder partway, just enough to glance at something inside without turning it toward me yet. "I want to be straightforward with you from the start, because I think you'll appreciate that more than careful phrasing. The notary seal your examiner flagged, the one appearing on both your adoption decree and this recent paternity test, matches a pattern our unit has been quietly building a case around for close to 2 years now. Falsified vital records, used specifically to alter inheritance and custody outcomes, going back decades in some instances. I thought of the flagged notary license I'd found buried in a decades-old disciplinary record, the one I'd written down without any way to confirm it meant anything. How many instances, more than I'm able to share with you today?" Ruiz said carefully. "But enough that this isn't, and I want to be very clear about this, an isolated event involving only your family." I sat with that for a moment, the diner noise around us suddenly distant, the same narrowing of attention I'd felt in Ellen's office weeks earlier, except sharper now, more consequential. "You said this connects to a case already open," I said. "Does that mean you already know who's behind it?" Ruiz studied me for a moment before answering, the careful, evaluating look of someone deciding exactly how much a person could handle hearing all at once. "We have a name," she said finally. "We've had it for a while. What we haven't had, until your report came in, was someone with a personal, verifiable connection willing to come forward and confirm it from the inside." She opened the folder fully now, turning it toward me across the table. "Nora, I need to ask you something, and I need you to take a moment before you answer. Does the name Vivian Marsh mean anything to you?" The name landed in my chest like something physical. "Vivian," I repeated, my voice coming out smaller than I intended. "My Aunt Paulette said that name once, months ago." She started to say something Vivian shouldn't have, and then stopped herself completely and refused to say another word about it. Something shifted in Ruiz's expression, the careful neutrality of a professional interview giving way, just slightly, to something more human. "That's useful. That's very useful, actually. Can you tell me exactly when that happened, and exactly what she said? I walked her through it. The afternoon at June's house, the gathering to divide her belongings, Paulette's outburst about blood and family, and later, alone in Paulette's front hallway." The half-sentence that had haunted the back of my mind for weeks, without ever quite resolving into anything I could act on. Ruiz took notes as I spoke, unhurried, occasionally asking a small clarifying question, the same patient, methodical approach I recognized from my own best work. When I finished, she set her pen down and folded her hands on the table. "I'm going to tell you something now that I'd normally hold back until I had more confirmation," she said. "But given what you just told me, I think you've earned hearing it plainly rather than in pieces. Vivian Marsh is a name that came up in our investigation 8 months ago, connected to a set of altered birth records from roughly 40 years back. We believe she may be a biological parent whose legal relationship to a child was deliberately obscured through falsified paperwork. The same pattern your examiner flagged in your own documents. The diner around us had gone strangely quiet in my ears, the way rooms sometimes do when your whole attention narrows down to a single point. You think she's my biological mother? I think it's a strong possibility, Rui said carefully. I don't want to confirm something this significant based on a partial match and a name overheard in a hallway. What I'd like to do, with your permission, is request an expedited comparison of your adoption records against the sealed birth record we already have on file for a Vivian Marsh, matching the right age and location from that era. If they match, we'll know for certain within a matter of days, not months. And if they match, I said slowly, working through the implications even as I said them out loud, that means someone altered my birth record specifically to remove her name from it. Not just the adoption paperwork, the birth record itself. That's consistent with the pattern we've been tracking. Yes. Ruiz's voice had gone gentler, the clinical case language softening around the edges of what she was actually telling me. I know this is an enormous amount to take in over coffee on a Tuesday afternoon. I don't say that to minimize it. I say it because I want you to know I understand exactly how much weight this carries, and I'm not going to rush you through processing it. I sat with my hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had long since gone cold, turning over 4 decades of a life I'd assumed, however imperfectly. I understood the basic shape of adopted as an infant, raised by Walter and Diane, a birth mother, gone before memory, never discussed, never questioned, because there had never seemed to be anything left to question. It was strange, sitting in that particular kind of shock, to realize how much of my identity I had built on the assumption that the missing pieces of my own story were simply gone, unrecoverable, rather than deliberately hidden by people who had every opportunity to hand them back to me and chose not to. Except there had been a whole other woman, apparently very much alive, whose name someone had gone to considerable trouble to erase from the one document that should have preserved it permanently. Is she still alive? I asked, and heard my own voice crack slightly around the question, the first crack I'd allowed myself in front of a stranger in longer than I could remember. Ruiz hesitated, just long enough that I understood the answer before she gave it. We believe so, she said. We haven't made direct contact yet. Given the sensitivity, and given that you've just confirmed a piece of the puzzle we didn't have before, I'd like your permission to proceed carefully, rather than reaching out to her cold, without preparation, on either side. Some truths, delivered wrong, do almost as much damage as the lie they're replacing. I thought of Walter's study, of the fear I'd seen cross his face when I said the word forged. I thought of Diane's voice cracking on the phone, the closest thing to honesty I'd heard from her in weeks. I thought of a woman somewhere out there, a stranger who might share my exact eyes, who might have spent 40 years believing something about me, or about what had happened to me. That wasn't true at all. Do it carefully, I said. But do it. I need to know. Ruiz nodded, closed her folder, and reached across the table, briefly, to rest her hand over mine. It was a small gesture, professionally unusual, I suspected, for someone in her line of work. It was, at that exact moment, exactly what I needed. And I found myself grateful, in a way I hadn't expected to be grateful to a stranger with a badge and a manila folder, that the person delivering this particular piece of my history had thought to make room for the human weight of it rather than treating it purely as a case update. I'll be in touch within the week, she said. Nora, whatever we find, I want you to know you did the right thing coming forward. A lot of people in your position wouldn't have. Ruiz called 5 days later, exactly within the window she'd promised. And this time I didn't sit down slowly at my desk. I stood in the middle of my kitchen, phone pressed hard against my ear, as though staying upright might somehow prepare me for whatever she was about to say. "We have a match," she said, without preamble, the same directness she'd used across the diner table. The sealed birth record on file for Vivian Marsh lists a daughter born the same year, same general region, as your own recorded birth date. The original record, before it was altered, named Vivian Marsh as the birth mother. Your name, at that point, wasn't Nora. It was listed differently, a name I can share with you when you're ready to see the full document. I sat down hard on one of my kitchen chairs, my legs no longer entirely trustworthy. "You're certain?" "As certain as government records get," Ruiz said. "We've cross-referenced hospital admission logs from that facility for the relevant dates as an additional confirmation, since the birth record itself had clearly been tampered with at some point after the original filing. Everything lines up. I wouldn't be telling you this over the phone if I had any real doubt left." I asked her to spell the name that had been listed for me on the original record, and she did, patiently, waiting while I wrote it down on the back of an envelope with a hand that wasn't entirely steady. It looked like a stranger's name on the page. It also somehow looked like it belonged to me in a way Nora Ashford said in Diane's careful, managing voice my whole life suddenly didn't quite anymore. I don't remember exactly what I said next. I remember thanking her, in a voice that sounded strange and distant even to my own ears, and I remember asking, before I could stop myself, whether she knew yet how Vivian had been told about me, what story she'd been given about what happened to her daughter. "We don't know the details yet," Ruiz said gently. "That's part of what I hope to learn when we make contact. I want to be honest with you. Nora, in most cases like this, the story given to the biological parent is designed to end the search permanently. Death, relocation with no forwarding information. Something final enough that hope stops making sense to keep." Something cold moved through me. A version of the same fear I imagined Vivian must have lived inside for 40 years, not knowing, only being told, and having no reason at the time to question people who'd presented themselves as trustworthy. Whatever story she'd been handed, whatever ending to her daughter's life she'd spent 4 decades quietly grieving, it had likely been manufactured for exactly one purpose: to make absolutely certain she never came looking. "When will you talk to her, carefully and soon?" Ruiz said. "I'll keep you informed at every step. But I need you to understand this may take a little longer than either of us wants. Some approaches require more delicacy than others. I don't want to cause her additional harm by rushing this the way your family apparently rushed the original decision 40 years ago." I understood the caution, even as every instinct in me wanted it to move faster, wanted the whole slow architecture of official process to simply dissolve so I could stand in front of this woman immediately and ask her, directly, everything I'd been carrying for weeks. I made myself say, out loud, that I understood and mostly meant it. Some part of me, the part that had spent a career learning exactly how much damage a rushed, poorly handled disclosure could do to a fragile situation, knew Ruiz was right to move deliberately. The rest of me simply wanted my mother, whatever that word turned out to mean now, in front of me, today. With no more careful intermediaries standing between us. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, the late afternoon light shifting slowly across the room, and let myself feel the full, disorienting sighs of what had just been confirmed. Not a rumor. Not a half sentence swallowed in a hallway. A record. A name. A woman somewhere who might have spent 4 decades grieving a daughter who had, this entire time, been alive, thriving even, close enough that a determined search might have found her years earlier if anyone had ever bothered to look honestly. I thought about Paulette, about the specific fear that had crossed her face the moment Vivian's name slipped out of her own mouth in that front hallway. Gardening gloves still on, the trowel trembling faintly in her hand. Paulette knew more than she'd admitted. I was increasingly certain, not everything. Perhaps Diane had made sure of that. I suspected, parceling out just enough truth to keep the people around her useful, and just little enough to keep them controllable. But Paulette knew more than a stray half-sentence overheard once in an unguarded moment. And after everything Ruiz had just confirmed, I was no longer willing to let her hide behind the same vague, wounded evasions that had worked on me for 30 years. I picked up my phone again before I'd fully decided to, and called her. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice cautious, the particular wariness of someone who'd been waiting for this call without quite admitting it to herself. "Paulette," I said, "I know who Vivian is now. I think it's time you told me the rest." Paulette agreed to see me that same evening, which told me, more than anything she'd said on the phone, exactly how much she'd been waiting, in some dread-filled corner of herself, for this conversation to finally happen. She met me at her front door without the gardening gloves this time, in an old cardigan, her hands empty and visibly unsteady. She led me to her kitchen rather than the front hallway, sat me down at a small table, and, before I could say anything at all, started talking, as though she'd been rehearsing it in her head for weeks and simply needed permission to finally let it out. "I didn't know everything," she said first, her voice thin. "I want you to understand that. I didn't know the full shape of what Diane did. I knew pieces. I told myself for a long time that not knowing all of it meant I wasn't really responsible for any of it. I don't believe that anymore." I waited. I had learned, over the past several weeks, that silence pulled more out of frightened people than any question I could ask them directly, and I let it stretch now, watching Paulette's hands tighten around her mug. "Tell me what you do know." Paulette wrapped both hands around a mug of tea she didn't drink from, staring into it rather than at me. "About 40 years ago, not long after Diane and Walter brought you home, Diane came to me. She was frightened, Nora, genuinely frightened, in a way I'd never seen from her before or since. She said there'd been complications with the adoption, that the birth mother's family had threatened to contest it, that if it went to court, the whole thing could fall apart and you'd be taken from them." "Was that true?" "I don't know." Paulette had admitted, "I believed it at the time. I had no reason not to. Diane asked me to help her keep something safe, some documents, and to never mention a name if it ever came up. Vivian. She said saying it out loud could put the whole arrangement at risk, could get you taken away from the only family you'd ever know. I thought I was protecting a baby. I thought I was protecting you." "And the money?" I asked, remembering Evelyn's observation, the particular emptiness of Paulette's decades-old grudge. So specific in its cruelty, and so vague in its actual substance. "Was there a payment?" Paulette flinched, an honest, unguarded flinch that told me the answer before she spoke it. "A small amount over the years. Diane framed it as helping with expenses, back when my daughter was young and money was tight. I told myself it wasn't connected to any of this. I told myself a lot of things, Nora, for a very long time. And the resentment, I said quietly. The comments. Calling me not really family. Where did that come from? If you thought you were protecting me, Paulette's eyes filled, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked, to me, less like a source of old cruelty and more like a woman who had spent decades quietly collapsing under the weight of a secret she'd never wanted in the first place. I resented you, she said, because every time I looked at you, I remembered what I'd agreed to keep quiet. And it was easier to be angry at you than to sit with what that silence had actually cost. It wasn't fair. It was never fair. You were a child. None of this was ever your doing. She wiped roughly at her eyes with the back of one hand. I've spent 30 years punishing you for a decision I made. Not one you did. I sat with that, the old wound and the new understanding of it existing side by side, neither one canceling the other out completely. It was strange, learning that the cruelty I'd carried since childhood had never really been about me at all. That it had been, this whole time, Paulette's own guilt wearing my name like a mask because it was easier to aim resentment outward than to hold it where it actually belonged. It didn't undo 30 years of small, accumulated wounds. It did, at least, finally explain them. I need you to tell all of this to Detective Ruiz, I said. Not just to me. It needs to be on record. Paulette nodded slowly, some of the tension visibly leaving her shoulders, as though she'd been waiting 40 years for someone to finally ask her to say it where it counted. I should have done it a long time ago. I kept telling myself it wasn't my secret to tell. She looked up at me, her expression raw in a way I'd never seen from her. I'll tell her everything. And Nora, if it matters at all, I'm sorry. Not the kind of sorry that fixes anything. Just the kind that's true. I didn't tell her it was fine. I had learned, over the past several weeks, that I no longer owed anyone that particular reassurance simply because it made a difficult moment easier for them to sit inside. It's a start, I said instead, which was, as far as I could tell, the most honest thing I had to offer her. I left her house a little while later, the cool evening air a relief after the close, overheated kitchen and everything that had been said inside it. Driving home, I found myself thinking less about Paulette's guilt and more about the word she'd used, arrangement. Diane had framed the entire deception, from the very beginning, as an arrangement, a piece of careful management rather than a theft. I was beginning to understand exactly how Diane approached everything that mattered to her not as a relationship, but as a structure to be maintained, a set of moving parts kept quietly in place by whatever combination of money, fear, and half-truths the situation required. I wondered, not for the first time that week, what it would take to finally make that structure collapse in full view of everyone it had been built to deceive. Ruiz called again 9 days later, her voice carrying a different quality than it had in either of our previous conversations. Something closer to careful excitement than clinical procedure. We made contact, she said. Vivian Marsh is alive. She's 63, retired, lives about 3 hours from here. And Nora, I need to tell you the story she's carried for 40 years, because I think you deserve to understand exactly what was done to her too, not just to you. I sat down at my kitchen table, the same table that had held Ellen's report, Walter's paternity test, my own adoption decree. So many documents over the past weeks that the wood grain itself had started to feel like part of the case file. She was told you died, Rui said. Shortly after birth, a complication during delivery, she was told something the hospital handled quietly to spare the family additional grief. She never saw a body. She was young, barely out of her teens, pressured by her own family to give up the pregnancy in the first place. And by the time she was well enough to ask real questions, everyone around her had already agreed on a story that made further questions feel cruel to keep asking. She never doubted it. She told me she doubted it constantly. For years. Ruiz said, quieter now. But doubt without evidence doesn't go very far, especially when the people around you have every incentive to keep reassuring you there's nothing left to find. She grieved you, Nora, genuinely, deeply, for 4 decades. She kept a small memorial, a single photograph, a date she marked privately every year. She built an entire private ritual of mourning around a death that never happened. I pressed the heel of my hand against my eyes, unprepared for how physically the grief hit me. Grief that wasn't even mine originally. Borrowed now from a woman I'd never met, mourning a version of me that had never existed in the first place. I thought of the wooden box on my dresser, June's brooch resting inside it, and understood with a fresh and different kind of ache that at least 2 women in my life had spent decades quietly loving a version of me they weren't fully permitted to claim out loud. I thought of Diane, of the word she'd used on the phone weeks earlier, protecting, and felt something in my chest go cold and very still. Whatever Diane believed she'd been protecting, it clearly hadn't been either of us. Does she know now that I'm alive? She does, Ruiz said. I handled that part myself, in person, with a grief counselor present, exactly the way these disclosures are supposed to be handled and so rarely are. She's overwhelmed, frightened, honestly, in a way I think you'll recognize. 40 years is a long time to build a life around one version of events. Finding out that version was constructed, deliberately, by people who profited from her believing it. That's its own kind of injury, separate from the joy of learning you're alive. Can I talk to her? She asked the same question about you, almost word for word before I'd even finished explaining the situation. Ruiz said, and for the first time in our acquaintance, I heard something that sounded almost like a smile in her voice. I think you two should talk, carefully, on her timeline as much as yours, but yes, I have her number, with her permission to share it with you directly. I wrote it down with a hand that wasn't entirely steady. The same unsteady hand that had copied down my own unfamiliar birth name weeks earlier, and sat looking at the 10 digits for a long time after Ruiz and I said our goodbyes. I didn't call immediately. I sat with it first, the way I'd sit with any decision heavy enough to deserve real consideration rather than reflexive action. I called Camille instead, briefly, mostly just to say the words out loud to someone before I said them to the one person they mattered most to. Camille didn't tell me what to say. She just told me, gently, that there was no version of this conversation I could get wrong simply by being honest in it, and that seemed, in the end, like the only advice actually worth taking. I thought about what I might say to Vivian herself, rehearsed and discarded a dozen opening lines, none of which felt remotely adequate to the size of what we were both about to step into. In the end, I didn't use any of them. I dialed the number a little after 7 that evening, my heart working hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. And when a woman's voice answered, cautious, uncertain, clearly braced for the possibility that this call might somehow still turn out to be a mistake, I found that the only words that actually came were the simplest ones available to me. "Hi," I said. "My name is Nora. I think I might be your daughter." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, filled with something I couldn't yet name. And then, quietly, unmistakably, the sound of someone crying in a way that had clearly been waiting 40 years for permission to finally happen. "I know who you are," Vivian said, her voice breaking around every word. "I've known your name for exactly 11 days, and I don't think I've stopped saying it since." She laughed then. A small, disbelieving sound caught somewhere between joy and grief. The two feelings apparently too tangled together after 40 years to arrive separately anymore. "I'm sorry. I don't know what I'm supposed to say to you. I've imagined this call 1,000 times, and somehow I never once imagined what I'd actually say if it stopped being imaginary." We met in person 2 weeks later, at a small park roughly halfway between our two lives. A neutral, open space neither of us had any history with, chosen deliberately, I think, because neither of us wanted the weight of an unfamiliar living room on top of everything else the day already carried. I saw her before she saw me, sitting on a bench near the entrance, a woman in a soft gray cardigan with her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching the path with the particular stillness of someone who has been waiting, in one form or another, for a very long time. I knew her immediately, not from memory, obviously. From the mirror, the shape of her jaw, the specific set of her eyes, features I'd spent 40 years assuming were simply mine, unattached to anyone, suddenly, visibly, belonging to someone else first. She stood when she saw me, and for a moment neither of us moved any closer, just stood there taking each other in across a distance of maybe 20 feet that felt, in that particular moment, considerably larger. "You have my mother's hands," Vivian said finally, her voice unsteady, breaking the stillness. I didn't expect that. I don't know why I didn't expect that. I crossed the remaining distance, and we stood there for a moment, awkward in the specific way two people are awkward when the situation calls for an embrace. Neither of them has earned the muscle memory for yet. "I don't really know how to do this," I admitted. "I've been rehearsing what to say for 2 weeks, and none of it feels right now that I'm actually standing here." "I know," Vivian said. "I've been doing the same thing. I had an entire speech planned. I've already forgotten most of it. We sat together on the bench, close but not quite touching, and talked, haltingly at first, then with gathering momentum, the particular rhythm of two people mapping the outline of 40 missing years in a single afternoon. She asked about my work, and laughed genuinely when I explained what a title examiner actually did for a living, saying she'd never have guessed her daughter would grow up to be someone who spent her days catching exactly the kind of lie that had been used against us both. I asked about her, careful, small questions at first, the kind that leave room for someone to share only as much as they're ready to. She told me about her own life since, a marriage that hadn't lasted, a career in accounting she'd found unexpected steadiness in, a quiet house in a quiet town she'd built slowly, deliberately, around the absence she'd never stopped carrying. "I want you to know," she said, at one point, turning to face me directly, "that I never stopped wanting you. I know that might not mean much, given everything, but I need you to hear it plainly. I was young and scared, and my family made the decision feel like it wasn't really a decision at all, more like something happening to me rather than something I was choosing. I've regretted it every day since, even before I knew there was a specific reason to—" "I believe you," I said, and found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I meant it completely. Whatever anger I'd accumulated over the past weeks, it had never once, even briefly, attached itself to her. Detective Ruiz told me some of what your family did. Vivian continued, her voice tightening. The money, the lies, on both sides, kept up for 40 years so no one would ever come looking hard enough to find the other. I keep trying to understand how anyone lives with something like that decade after decade. And I can't. I genuinely can't. I don't think I can either, I said. I've been trying since I found out. I don't think understanding it is actually the point anymore. I think the point is just deciding what to do next, regardless of whether the why ever fully makes sense. Vivian reached over, slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away if I needed to, and took my hand. Her fingers were cool, slightly trembling, and I let her hold it, surprised by how natural the gesture felt for something we were both, technically, doing for the first time. I don't expect anything from you, she said. I want to be clear about that, right at the start. I'm not looking to make up for 40 years in one afternoon, or to insert myself into your life faster than you're ready for. I just wanted you to know I'm here now, whatever pace feels right to you. I'll match it. It was. I would come to understand over the following months exactly the right thing to say, and exactly the kind of patient, ungrasping presence I hadn't realized. Until that moment, I had been quietly hoping for my entire life. It struck me, sitting there, how different this felt from every conversation I'd ever had with Diane, where affection had always seemed to arrive with a quiet, unspoken invoice attached. Vivian asked for nothing. She simply sat beside me, present and unhurried, offering exactly as much of herself as I was ready to receive and not one demand more. We sat on that bench for 2 more hours, past the point where the afternoon light had started going gold and long across the grass. Neither of us in any particular hurry to be the one who suggested it was time to go. Walter's text arrived on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after that first afternoon on the park bench. At almost the exact moment I was starting to believe the family might simply let the whole matter dissolve quietly under the weight of my silence. We'd like to finalize the trust paperwork properly, he wrote, the tone carefully warm in a way that felt, by then, entirely transparent to me. Your mother and I thought it would be meaningful to do it at your birthday celebration next month. 40th birthdays deserve a proper family gathering. We'll invite everyone. Bring the signed beneficiary form, and we can put all of this behind us. I read the message 3 times, sitting at my kitchen table, feeling something settle into place that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with recognition. They intended to use my own birthday, the one occasion in a family's calendar meant to celebrate a person rather than manage them, as the stage for exactly the kind of coordinated pressure I'd already watched them attempt once, in Walter's office, with water glasses arranged like a closing. I called Ruiz first. They want to do it at my birthday party, I told her, and heard, on the other end of the line, a brief pause that told me she was already turning the idea over the way I had. That's actually useful, if you're willing to consider it that way, she said carefully. A public setting, planned in advance, with family present. If they intend to present the fraudulent document again, openly in front of witnesses, that gives us a clean, well-documented moment to act rather than a private confrontation we'd have to reconstruct after the fact from memory alone. You want to use my birthday as an operation. I want to give you the option, Ruiz said. This is your call entirely. Nora, I can pursue this quietly through normal channels instead. Warrants, formal interviews, a slower process that keeps you further from the center of it. Or, if you're willing, we can be present at the event itself, with your permission and Vivian's, and let whatever they intend to do play out somewhere. It can be properly witnessed and documented. Start to finish. I thought about Diane's voice on the phone weeks earlier, tight and controlled, insisting she'd spent 40 years protecting this family. I thought about Walter's study, the fear that had crossed his face for one unguarded second before he'd composed himself back into denial. I thought about the 60 relatives who would fill that room, the same kind of crowd that had once stood silent at June's house while I was accused of things that weren't true and understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful. Exactly what I wanted this time to look like instead. I want to be there, I said. I want to let them do exactly what they're planning to do, and then I want it to end, completely, in front of everyone who's ever watched this family manage its own reputation instead of telling the truth. I called Vivian next and asked her the same question Ruiz had asked me, framed as gently as I knew how. Would she be willing to come, to stand in a room full of strangers who had spent decades believing a story built specifically to keep her away, and let herself be seen? She was quiet for a long moment before answering. I've spent 40 years being told, one way or another, to disappear quietly and not make things complicated for anyone else's comfort, she said finally. I think I'm finished doing that. Yes, I'll come. Over the following weeks, the three of us built the plan carefully, methodically, the way I'd build a case file at work. Each piece checked and rechecked before it went into place. Ruiz coordinated the legal timing, ensuring nothing about the confrontation itself would compromise the broader investigation already underway. Vivian gathered the courage, in her own words, to finally stand in a room she'd spent decades imagining only from the outside. I gathered the evidence, Ellen's report, Paulette's recorded statement, everything organized the way I'd organize any file I intended to present without a single weak point left exposed. I told no one else, not Preston, not Camille, though I promised her when she asked why I'd gone quiet about the upcoming party, that she'd understand everything soon enough and that I needed her there, simply as herself. On the day it happened, she didn't push, though I could tell it cost her something not to. She'd earned the right to ask harder questions than she did that week, and I was grateful, not for the first time, that she trusted me enough not to. The date arrived faster than I expected, the way significant dates always seem to, no matter how much advance warning you've had. I stood in front of my own mirror the night before, the way I imagined I might have stood in front of it 40 times before under far more ordinary circumstances, and told myself, quietly, that whatever happened the next day, I would not be the one who flinched first. I had spent my entire life being underestimated by people who mistook my composure for compliance. I intended, for the first time, to let that particular mistake work entirely in my favor, I thought, before I finally turned off the light that night, about June's wind chime, still hanging on that quiet back patio somewhere, moving in whatever breeze happened to find it, whether or not anyone was there to listen. She had never needed proof to know who I was. Tomorrow, I thought, everyone else finally would. The Cedar House restaurant looked exactly the way I remembered from the cold open of this story. Warm light spilling through tall windows. The private dining room reserved for something that was, on its surface, supposed to be a celebration. I arrived early, deliberately, wanting a few minutes to steady myself before the room filled. Diane had spared no expense this time, an actual departure from the modest gatherings of my childhood, and I understood, walking through the entrance, that this generosity had never been about me. A bigger room meant a bigger audience. A bigger audience meant more weight behind whatever performance Walter intended to deliver. 60 relatives arrived over the next half hour, Cousins and second cousins and family friends I mostly recognized from holidays and funerals, filling the space with the low, comfortable murmur of people who believed they were attending an ordinary party. Preston circulated with his phone raised, capturing candid moments for whatever version of the evening he planned to post later. Still, as far as I could tell, genuinely unaware of what the night actually held. I found Camille near the back of the room and squeezed her hand once. Briefly, a small signal I'd promised her in advance would mean simply stay close and trust me. She squeezed back, steady, asking nothing further. And I felt, even in the middle of everything I was about to walk into, a small flare of gratitude for exactly how well she understood me by now, that a single silent gesture could carry the whole weight of what I couldn't yet explain out loud, across the room. I caught sight of Paulette near one of the tall windows, her hands folded tightly in front of her, watching me with an expression I hadn't seen from her before, something between dread and resolve. She had promised me, on the phone 2 nights earlier, that she would be here. That whatever happened tonight, she wouldn't stay silent again. I gave her the smallest possible nod, and she returned it, her chin lifting slightly, like someone bracing herself before stepping off a ledge she'd been circling for 30 years. Walter found me a little after the meal had been cleared, a leather folder tucked under one arm. Diane, a half step behind him with an expression composed carefully enough that only someone who'd spent weeks learning to read past it would have noticed the strain underneath. "Everyone," Walter said, tapping a fork gently against his glass, drawing the room's attention the way he always did, effortlessly. A lifetime of practice at commanding rooms without raising his voice. "Before we get to dessert, I wanted to take care of a small piece of family business. Nora, would you come up here for a moment?" I walked to the front of the room, aware of 60 pairs of eyes following me, aware, too, of exactly how deliberately this had all been staged. The same instinct for spectacle Walter had used in his office weeks earlier, scaled up now to fill an entire private dining room. "As most of you know," Walter continued, addressing the room rather than me directly, "we're finalizing some important changes to Ashford Properties. Part of that process required a paternity test as part of our legal review." He opened the folder, withdrew a single sheet, and held it toward me. "This is the result. It confirms what our attorneys flagged some months ago. Nora isn't a biological heir under the terms of the original trust. I need you to sign this updated beneficiary form tonight, in front of everyone, so we can finally move forward as a family." A ripple moved through the room. Murmurs. A few sharply indrawn breaths. The particular electric hush of people realizing they were witnessing something they hadn't been told to expect. "You're not a real heir," Walter said again, more quietly now, just for me, though the microphone carried it to every corner of the room regardless. "Sign your share away. Nora, let's put this behind us tonight." Before I could answer, Diane stepped forward and reached for the folder resting on the table beside me, the one holding the deed to the family properties. The physical document representing everything Walter's plan depended on transferring cleanly to Preston. She pulled it from under my hand with a swift, practiced motion, holding it against her chest like something she was reclaiming rather than something she was taking. I let it happen. I had known, walking in tonight, exactly what this moment would look like, had rehearsed my own stillness the way I might rehearse composure before a difficult closing, and I stood there now, letting the scene play out precisely the way they'd planned it, giving away nothing of what was about to follow. Somewhere near the back of the room, I knew, Ruiz was already positioned, quiet and unremarkable in a simple dark coat, watching everything unfold exactly the way she'd promised she would. "I have a question," I said, my voice steady, cutting cleanly through Walter's carefully built momentum. "Before I sign anything, where exactly did this paternity test come from? Which laboratory ran it?" Walter's composure flickered, just slightly, the same flicker I'd watched cross his face in his study weeks earlier. "That's not really relevant to— It's relevant to me," I said. "I'd like an answer." The room had gone very quiet now, 60 people sensing, without quite understanding why, that the evening had shifted onto ground none of them had been prepared for. That was the moment the doors at the back of the dining room opened. Vivian walked in first. She wore a simple navy dress, her hands steady now in a way they hadn't been the first time I saw her on that park bench, holding a single sealed folder against her chest. Beside her walked Detective Ruiz, and behind them, 2 uniformed officers, unhurried, deliberate, the kind of presence that changes the temperature of a room without a single raised voice. The murmur that moved through the crowd this time wasn't curious, it was disbelieving. "Who?" Diane started, and then stopped, the folder still clutched against her chest, her face draining of color so fast I watched it happen in real time, watched 40 years of careful management collapse in the space of about 3 seconds. "My name is Vivian Marsh," Vivian said, her voice carrying clearly across the stunned room, steadier than I had any right to expect given everything I knew it was costing her to say it. "I am Nora's biological mother. I was told 40 years ago that she died shortly after birth. That was a lie." She opened the folder and held up a single document, a certified copy, its seal unmistakably official in a way the one on Walter's paternity test had never quite managed to be. "This is Nora's original birth record," she said. "Before it was altered, my name is on it. It has always been on it. Sealed away where none of you thought anyone would ever think to look." The room had gone entirely silent now, 60 people frozen in the particular stillness of witnesses realizing, all at once, that the story they'd been handed at the start of the evening was not the story actually unfolding in front of them. Somewhere near the front tables, a cousin I barely knew whispered something to the person beside her, and the whisper rippled outward in a slow, widening circle until the entire room seemed to be holding its breath at once, waiting to see which version of the night would actually win. I looked at Vivian, standing steady under the weight of every eye in the room, and felt something settle inside me that had nothing to do with vindication and everything to do with recognition. Whatever else happened in the next several minutes, this part, at least, could never be undone. She had been seen. 60 witnesses now knew her name, knew her face, knew that she had never once, in 40 years, been the woman my family's story had made her out to be. "Walter," Diane said, her voice cracking around his name, "tell them this is absurd. Tell them." But Walter said nothing. He stood frozen beside the table, the paternity test still in his hand, staring at Vivian's document like a man watching the exact shape of his own undoing arrive precisely on schedule. Across the room, Paulette stepped forward, her voice shaking but clear. "I need to say something." "Paulette, don't," Diane said, sharp, desperate now, all pretense of composure gone. "I've kept this quiet for 30 years. "Diane," Paulette said, her voice shaking but growing steadier with every word. 30 years of silence finally breaking loose all at once. "I can't do it anymore. You paid me to stay silent. You told me the birth family was threatening to take Nora away. that saying anything could get the adoption overturned. I believed you for a long time. I don't believe you anymore. Diane's mouth opened and closed. No sound emerging. The practiced composure that had carried her through 40 years finally, visibly, entirely gone. I had spent weeks imagining what this moment might look like, and none of my imagining had quite captured how small she would seem, standing there, the family deed still clutched uselessly against her chest. Every careful sentence she'd ever used to manage a room finally, completely failing her. "Mrs. Ashford," Ruiz said, stepping forward, her voice calm, professional, utterly without theater. "We have a certified forensic report confirming the paternity document your husband presented tonight is fraudulent. We have a matching forgery on Nora's original adoption decree, produced from the same source, 40 years apart. We have Vivian Marsh's sealed original birth record, and we have a witness statement from Paulette Hensley describing payments made to maintain her silence. I'd like you to come with us to answer some questions." Preston lowered his phone slowly, the recording light still blinking, his face draining of the easy, oblivious warmth it had carried all evening. He looked, for the first time since I'd known him as an adult, genuinely lost, the golden, uncomplicated version of family he'd grown up inside of, collapsing in real time, in front of a room full of relatives who would talk about this night for years afterward, regardless of what any of us wanted. Somewhere behind me, I heard someone whisper, unmistakably, "Oh my God, this is real," and understood, with a strange, distant clarity, that whatever Preston had captured on that phone in the last several minutes, unedited and unposted, was about to become the single most honest piece of documentation this family had ever produced about itself. Diane looked at me then, finally, directly, for what felt like the first time in weeks. "Nora," she said, her voice small, stripped of every careful management technique she'd built her whole identity around. The woman who had once handed me a wooden box on a quiet patio now standing exposed in front of everyone who had ever believed her version of our family. "I can explain. You've had 40 years, I said. "I don't think you can." I stood, letting the silence stretch for a moment before I answered her, because I had learned, over the past several months, exactly how much weight a well-placed silence could carry. "No," I said finally. "You've had 40 years, and every single one of them was a choice. Not one moment of it was an accident you can walk back now with an explanation." I turned to face the room. 60 relatives who had come expecting cake and easy conversation. Now sitting in the wreckage of a family they thought they understood. I recognized, in that moment, the same faces that had once watched me sit accused of things that weren't true and said nothing in my defense. I felt no need to shame anyone individually for that silence tonight. I only needed them to hear, clearly and without ambiguity, what had actually happened, so that whatever version of this story eventually made its way around family dinners for years afterward, it would at least start from something true. "I'm not here to ask any of you to choose sides," I said, my voice steady, carrying clearly across the stunned quiet. "This isn't your fight. But I want to say this plainly, once, so there's no confusion about it later. My mother did not steal me from anyone. Diane and Walter built an entire structure of lies to keep me from knowing where I actually came from, and profited from it financially for decades. And tonight, finally, that structure is over." I looked at Walter, still frozen and beside the table, the fraudulent document hanging useless in his hand. "The paternity test is fake," I said. "You know that, I know that, Everyone in this room is about to know it too. Whatever legal claim you thought you were building tonight, it's finished. I turned to Diane last. The family deed, I said, nodding toward the folder still clutched against her chest. That's frozen. Effective tonight. Pending the outcome of the investigation. You don't get to walk away from this evening with anything you came here intending to take. Ruiz stepped forward then, her voice calm and procedural, cutting cleanly through the tension without adding to it. Mrs. Ashford, Mr. Ashford, I'd like you both to come with us now to answer some questions. This can happen quietly, or it can happen in front of everyone currently watching. That choice is yours. Diane didn't answer. She simply set the folder down on the table, slowly, deliberately, the small, defeated gesture of someone finally recognizing there was nothing left to hold on to, and let one of the officers guide her toward the door. Walter followed a step behind her, saying nothing at all. The silence between them somehow louder than anything either of them might have said. I watched them go and felt, standing there in the wreckage of a party that had never really been mine to begin with, something I hadn't expected to feel at all in that moment. Not triumph, exactly. Something quieter and steadier, closer to relief. 40 years of carefully managed silence had just ended in the space of about 10 minutes. And whatever came next, legally, financially, within what remained of this family, none of it could ever be quietly buried again the way everything before it had been. Vivian crossed the room to stand beside me, close enough that our shoulders touched, and I let her, grateful for the solid, uncomplicated warmth of someone who had never once, in the short time I'd known her, asked me for anything I wasn't ready to give. "Are you all right?" she asked quietly. "I don't know yet," I admitted. "Ask me again tomorrow." Camille appeared on my other side a moment later, having pushed through the stunned crowd without a word, and took my hand without needing an explanation for any of it. Paulette stood a short distance away, tears streaming openly down her face, watching me with an expression that looked, for the first time since I'd known her, entirely without pretense. I didn't stay for the rest of the evening. There didn't seem to be any version of staying that made sense, not with the room still buzzing with shock, not with Preston standing alone near the head table, staring at his own phone like he no longer recognized what was on it. I caught his eye once, on my way toward the door, and saw something there I hadn't expected. Not anger, not defensiveness, just a kind of stunned private grief for a version of his parents he was only now realizing he'd never actually known. I didn't stop to say anything to him. There would be time for that later, if either of us wanted it. Once the shock had settled into something we could actually speak to each other about. I walked out of the Cedar House with Vivian on one side and Camille on the other, into the cool night air, and didn't look back once. Whatever was left to say to that family, it would have to happen somewhere else, on some other day, if it happened at all. For tonight, walking out into the dark with the two people who had shown up for me without ever once asking for proof of what I deserved, felt like exactly enough. Behind us, through the tall windows of the Cedar House, I could see the party still slowly dissolving. 60 relatives gathering coats and phones and half-formed theories about what they'd just witnessed. None of it my responsibility to manage or explain any further tonight. For the first time in longer than I could easily measure, I let someone else's confusion simply belong to them. It has been 6 months now since that night at the Cedar House, and I want to tell you honestly, the way I've tried to tell you everything else, exactly where things stand, without smoothing over the parts that are still difficult or pretending the ending arrived neater than it actually did. Diane was charged with fraud and falsification of vital records. Among several related counts, I won't pretend to fully understand the legal architecture of, since that part of this story was never really mine to narrate. Walter was charged as well, on lesser counts tied directly to the paternity document he'd presented that night. I don't know yet how the courts will ultimately resolve any of it, and I've made a kind of peace with not needing to control that part. I gave Detective Ruiz everything I had. The rest belongs to a system built to handle it more carefully than I ever could alone. Ashford Properties is under new, closely supervised management now. Its ownership records fully unwound and rebuilt from verified documentation, rather than the version Walter had been quietly constructing for years. My original share in the family trust was restored, formally, cleanly, exactly as it should have been all along. I haven't decided yet what to do with it. Some decisions, I've learned, deserve more time than the moment that creates them. Preston reached out 3 weeks after the party, tentative, clearly still working through the collapse of an entire version of his parents he'd never had reason to question before. We've talked a handful of times since, careful, honest conversations neither of us is rushing. He told me, the last time we spoke, that he'd started therapy, that he was trying to understand how much of his own comfort growing up had been quietly built on what was taken from me. I don't know exactly what our relationship becomes from here. I know it's the first real one we've ever actually had, unmanaged by anyone else's careful staging. Paulette calls every few weeks. She never mentions the party directly, never asks me to forgive her outright, but she shows up, consistently, in small, steady ways, sharing a recipe, asking honestly about my work, letting the relationship rebuild itself slowly instead of demanding I declare it repaired before it's ready to be. I let her. It feels, most days, like exactly the right amount of grace to extend. No more and no less. Vivian and I see each other most weekends now, usually at her kitchen table over coffee that's nowhere near as good as she thinks it is. A small, ongoing joke between us that somehow never stops being funny to either of us. We're still learning the shape of what we are to each other, still discovering small, startling overlaps. A shared habit of tapping a pen when we're thinking, an identical laugh neither of us had ever heard from anyone else before. The particular way we both go quiet when we're working through something difficult instead of talking it out loud immediately. It isn't the relationship either of us lost 40 years ago. Neither of us pretends it could be. It's a new one, built slowly and honestly in its place, without any of the old debts or obligations attached to it. And I've come to believe that might actually be the better version, precisely because neither of us owes the other anything beyond what we choose, freely, to give. I've spent a fair amount of time since that night trying to understand why Diane did what she did. Not to excuse it, but because I've learned that understanding tends to matter more to me than anger does. In the long run, a therapist I started seeing after everything came out offered a theory I've turned over often. Diane's entire sense of self, she suggested, had been built around control, around the careful management of every visible detail of her life. And somewhere in that architecture, my very existence had become a variable she couldn't fully manage, a truth that might, at any moment, escape the structure she'd built to contain it. She didn't erase my history because she hated me. She erased it because she was frightened of what it meant about the story she'd been telling herself for 40 years. It doesn't excuse what she did. It does. At least, explain it. And what was my part in all of this? I've asked myself that question more than once, the way I ask myself hard questions about any file that doesn't fully add up. For most of my life, I made it easy for people to underestimate what I deserved. because I'd learned early that quiet compliance was safer than asking difficult questions out loud. I don't think that instinct disappears overnight. I think I'm simply learning slowly to notice when I'm falling back into it, and to choose differently when I can. If there's one thing I want you to take from everything I've told you, it's this. Your worth was never something other people got to determine by how well or how badly they treated you. If someone in your life consistently makes you feel like an inconvenience, like a complication to be managed, rather than a person to be loved plainly, that isn't a reflection of what you deserve. It's information about them. Setting a boundary in response to that isn't cruelty. It's the most basic form of self-respect available to any of us. I'm 40 years old now. I have a career I built with my own hands. A mother who never stopped loving me even when she believed I was gone. A friend who has driven across town at midnight more times than either of us can count. A brother I'm cautiously, carefully getting to know for the first time. And a family that looks nothing like the one I grew up inside. Built instead from the people who actually showed up when it mattered, rather than the people who happened to share my legal paperwork. The family I was raised by set out, deliberately, to erase me. Instead, in the end, they simply set me free to find the truth on my own terms, and to build something honest in its place. Thank you for staying with me through all of this. If any part of this story made you look differently at the people in your own life, the ones who lift you honestly, and the ones who only ever managed you carefully, I hope you'll pass it along to someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't yet, I'd be glad to have you back for the next one.